Hi, Mage fans. This is your host, Harry Robinson with Mage the Podcast. And joining me today for Tomes of Magic M20 Victorian Age Electric Boogaloo is Pookaji from Changeling the Podcast. So how you doing, Pook?
I'm doing fantastically. I'll leave it at that.
Normally Adam does these, so I feel like by law I have to say, welcome to Mage the Podcast, working hard towards ascension so you don't have to. Traditionally, for a Tomes of Magic episode, we ask for announcements. Do you have any announcements, Pook?
Nothing in particular, except depending on when this episode goes out, if anyone listening is interested in homebrew changeling role-playing supplements and wanting to get involved, we are doing a passel of those for release in 2025 over at Changeling the Podcast, and interested in having authors, editors, artists, layout people, etc. So,
what is the significance of the year 2025?
Yes. Well, it will be the 30th anniversary of Changeling the Dreaming's release. And so we are trying to get a leg up on celebrating, planning in advance, etc.
So we're talking about Victorian Mage. This book came out in print this year. It is listed as copyright 2022. It's got a bunch of writers. It's got some art. It has no dedication, which felt weird. As it being Mage, it starts with an opening story. It takes place in the Republic of Colombia, South America, following a roughly parallel trail to the Orinoco River in 1891. A bunch of mages are exploring a Nephandic labyrinth, which they refer to as a pit. The Hermetic record is introduced as a kind of grand roll of everything a Hermetic has done. And it's a bunch of mages going through snarking at each other. And kind of the theme to me is this Sahaja cultist ecstasis person going, you Hermetics are going to doom us all by knowing things and figuring stuff out. And we get the idea that this kind of returns to a theme that Adam first keyed me into. In many of the struggles in Mage can be broken down into, do humans have a right and proper place in the cosmos from which they should not leave? Or can you strive? And the Hermetics are like, F you, we can. And some of the other groups are like, I don't know. How did you like the opening fiction, Pook, or did you take anything else from it?
Well, in terms of the snark, at least the hot Brazilian dream speaker wasn't really snarking at anybody, so I was okay with that. But yeah, to the point about the cultist kind of picking on this Hermetic for saying, oh, you're going to destroy mystery. The cultists really care that much about mystery? Because I always had the feeling that they were more about expanding experience. But, you know, unexperienced things weren't necessarily something to be left alone forever. I feel like this cultist in particular had an axe to grind with the Hermetics in particular, and that was their entire character.
And it also felt like it was a kind of a bit of like, yes, you're understanding it, but you're doing the wrong kind of understanding, which I could also kind of understand. The Cult of Ecstasy to me is always listed in a weird place in that it clearly breaks down into two wildly opposing groups. To me, you have your anchorite ascetic that is clearly a cultist, and you also have the hedonist, which is clearly an occultist, in the same way that like the Euthanatoi are clearly this weird combination of subcontinent mystics and kind of Greek magic. And I'm fine with that, to have those two pull together. I've always felt that the Cult of Ecstasy kind of had that same tension within it.
I feel like this prelude fiction is not okay with pulling things together.
Yes. So moving on, we have the introduction. It defines the Victorian era as 1837 to 1901, but makes that a little bit fuzzy in that it will go back to 1830 and even into 1905 as the kind of outer reaches of that, and will make further mentions to periods before and after that. It says that kind of the major thing happening now is the expansion of global empires. It specifically says that the Hermetics and the choristers are passively supporting this. Mages do support rebellion against this in many cases and try and stop imperialism and the destruction of culture and the advance of these political agendas, at least for a little bit. It says that change is possible, but very hard in general. And it notes that technology in this era is changing people's lives over the period of years and not centuries, that our notion of progress is being established, that within one's own lifetime, things can materially improve or change, possibly for the better. The technocracy, or the order of reason, believe strongly in what they are doing. They are quickly developing a global paradigm that kind of includes this set of technologies and advances. the wonders of the age are helping the world, but doing this very unevenly. The sick are receiving the first improvements in their quality of care in human history, seemingly. And then it starts making some claims which I think are kind of less supported. For instance, it says that income inequality soared. Generally over this period, Gini coefficients dropped, which is to say, I think what has failed to be considered is just how unequal things were before now. It is certainly the case that the rich got richer, but the poor had so little at the time that any improvement was, in terms of it being a pure ratio, if someone has a penny and you give them $1, their wealth has increased by a factor of 100. I think sometimes the text kind of fails to incorporate that. It says that the order of reason is mostly wealthy, that scientific racism was stopped by sleepers saying, no, that's wrong. It kind of strikes at novel forms of gameplay. We get a framework of how to handle history, of saying history is set, your characters likely can't avert it, except for at the very edges or if something wildly implausible happens. That history can be different and that things are already different, or that history is changeable. It likely already is. This is kind of a trichotomy of can't change, difficult to change, possible to change. It says that the mood of the game is going to be gaslit mystery. And even in this, it gives a plethora of options. It could say, gaslit in the technological sense, that it is a world illuminated by novel technologies. Gas in the coal sense, that everything is sooty and dark. Or it may be gaslit in the term we use in abuse for misdirecting and kind of causing a victim of this kind of abuse to question their own sanity. The questions that came out of this for me in the introduction are, will it help me run a game during this era? Are there interesting groups and characters that I will be able to use as a storyteller? And does it give me the tools to show colonialism, progress, and technology in a game, as well as give me an outline or a toolbox that, if those are the major things that players should be fighting against, show how to resist it? What were your thoughts on the introduction, or what do you think kind of the opening questions were for this book for you, Pook?
I think largely along the same lines, maybe with the addition that when it comes to historical settings in particular, I'm always looking for how is this setting going to feel different as a game from the core one or from Sorcerers Crusade or whatever. And what I take from this section, I think the two things that this book is primarily concerned with are framing colonialism and imperialism, which pop up dozens of times in this 6-page introduction as terms. Framing them, as something that is the primary antagonist of the entire book, which I'm here for that, but I suspect that a non-zero number of players would be interested in exploring other aspects of the period in addition to that. And then two, I feel like this book was a direct sort of attempt to stop people from liking the technocracy. I don't know how successful they were in doing that, but that's something that came through to me as I was reading through this. The way they kept talking about the order of reason as like this unmitigated negative for the world. And then you get to the order of reason chapter and it kind of comes across differently, but that's for later on. With gaslit mystery, in addition to that, the themes that they present are listed as the cost of technological progress, resistance, and imperialism. And I struggle to see how those fit into a gaslit mystery framework by any definition. I think you really have to mash those together to get it to fit.
It felt like they wanted one to be the background for the other.
Yeah.
And it can kind of work either way. Gaslit mystery in a world of progress, or progress in a world of gaslit mystery. But those, to me, are then no longer themes and moods. Those are all just themes.
Yeah.
Or story types.
And combining them like that gives it a very narrow focus.
Yes.
Which
one of the constant struggles of the book is, are we just talking about Victorian London, or is there a wider world? And we'll see if the book does a good job of balancing those two, because I think one of the most iconic pieces of artwork that we'll get to later is the Euthanatoy cowboy to me, where it's just like, I'm
here for that. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
2, please.
Yeah. But in the end, I just want to have the tools to run a game that interests me. And I'm curious whether it provides that for people who don't want to focus on colonialism and imperialism.
And just as a note, Pook and I were going over our notes beforehand. I have something like 5,000 words that I wrote in personal notes. And Pook, what was your ultimate word count?
7,927. I will abridge this.
Yes. In a normal episode, I will have between 2,000 and 3,000 words, and that will be a 90-minute episode. So we are going to move very quickly. If a particular thing that you liked wasn't gone over, it's not because we didn't necessarily like it, but we did have to kind of make some strategic choices. When we cover core rulebooks in Tomes of Magic, generally we only talk about, as Pook said, how does it differ from the main setting. So for instance, we won't go over the character creation rules in detail because they are nearly identical to what we get in M20 with a few notable differences that we will discuss.
Do you think it's fair to say that even if we don't talk about something, we certainly noticed it?
I think that is reasonable. This was my third or fourth reading through of this, and I combined all of my notes from those previous readings, which is partially why this looks like a ransom note I wrote to myself in terms of my write-up. Chapter 1 is entitled Societies of Shadow, and just kind of tries to lay out the basics of the setting. It mentions that focusing on eerie, gaslit mysteries ignores much of the culture and events of the time, to which I say, then why did you set it as the tone? It talks about how the very landscape of the world is changing. Telegraph lines and railroads are geomantic, and that as the world is mapped and stood and kind of brought under the hand of technology, places are disappearing, but not yet peoples. It says the city of El Dorado, the island of High Brazil, and the hundreds of lesser-known mythic sites fall not to musket fire, but to the compass and telescope. I prefer to think that compass and telescope are the names of two gigantic ether ships that just blew them off the ship, like the Enola Gay of the technocracy or something like that. Places are being mapped out of existence and aren't able to stop it. This felt at odds to the statement that said that scientific racism had been defeated by the people who knew that they were not lesser, but maybe more mystic places fall under different rules. Mages are in a position to see the change that is happening to the world and to kind of, at least in their microcosm, stop it. And the question then becomes, should they? We also get an early sidebar on, hey, this period was super prejudicial and super sexist. Pick where you want it to be. Great. I want that in any period book. I understand that some people will say, hey, if you're going to play the Victorian era without sexism and classism, that's really alternate history at that point, which, sure, from a lexicographic point, I will cede to that. Likewise, in a Dark Ages game, it seemed like it wanted it to mostly be about the difficulty of finding food and justifying why two people who were not married could spend time together. So,
and if they were married, to be having children at a brisk clip.
Yes, at an active pace. We then get information on kind of how mages are interfacing with the society. And it mentions that House Diadne was marginalized. What's the bad joke I make about this?
I don't know. It's the mother of all euphemisms for sure.
Yeah. House Diadne was straight out, in my notes, I have listed as straight out murderated.
Yeah.
Wizards of March was declared against them in a plot by House Tremere to kind of distract from their vampirism by accusing House Diadne in the Order of Hermes of infernalism. We get a run through of what the manners of the period of time would be. We get kind of a few key things on technologies. This kind of left me a little bit disappointed. After Sorcerers Crusade, which had 2 books with phenomenal walkthroughs of what the era was like, what the manner of thinking was like, how a town was laid out. This book seems to very quickly lean thoroughly on, what the Victorian era was like, and then kind of go on from that. If you want to see an example where this was done really well, look at any of the Pelgrane Press books. Fearful Symmetries and its explanation of 1920s Britain was a great mix of popular thought, popular media, the status of science at the time, and beautiful little facts like the fact that potato chips were becoming popular and they all had little bags of salt in them, so you could pick your level of saltiness.
Oh, beautiful.
Yeah. This is the era in which meritocracy arises. Re-education is being pushed by many people, including the Hermetics, the Chorus, and the Verbena. The Akashiana and the Dream Speakers are resisting, and that minor shadow wars are spreading across the world. That establishing novel social capital in a stratified society is difficult even for mages. At the end of the day, you can never move beyond your birth rank without some exceptional things happening, and kind of any dirt on your hands may impede you from social climbing. The Order of Reason and the Traditions are undergoing very aggressive recruitment attempts as both of their networks spread globally, that loyalty is tested, and then a mentor is found. And we may get the idea that the stress of colonization may induce additional awakenings, which I always liked as an idea, that people under adverse conditions will have more mages, not because they are necessarily special in some way, but people having very comfortable middle-class lives rarely face the challenge that would cause an awakening.
Yeah.
The Order of Reason is highly codified and strict. We have the precepts of Damien at this point. The traditions tend to be a bit more haphazard. The protocols do exist. We get an idea that there is an influx of new mages at this time, that crafts are abundant and everywhere, but they're kind of taking it in the face comparatively. We also get something new, the Secret Society. They seem to be kind of below the faction and above the band of mages in terms of its presence. There's this idea that there are places where like-minded people, even across factions, so across the Order of Reason, traditions, can get together and talk. And we get dozens scattered throughout the book. We get the Lion Society of Singapore, where elderly ghosts inform new members. We get the Boston Twists, which is a group dedicated to Curtomane. We get the Twilight Northerners, who just kind of explore. And it does what Mage is good at, giving a short list of interesting starts that are then wildly frustrating because everyone who reads them wants more information on it.
Don't forget the Parisian Mystic Diners Club that has 7-course meals made of bygone also in there.
The Devil's Dancers, who subdue spirits that have been bothered by colonialist expansion. I want to think that the Devil's Dancers are the nemesis to the Midnight Circus. And the fact that we don't have any more information on the Devil's Dancers suggests how that one turned out. We get a dozen extra in this chapter, from the Blue Cog Cognate that fights against imperialism to the Ivory Gentleman. The Rainmaker Society has tunnels that fade in and out of existence and seemingly span half of North America. Contemporaneously, the Unquiet Dead in East Asia are causing issues. The Indian Order of Reason is opposed to imperialism. The Four Ring Society is largely Japanese and wants to learn more about foreign Umbrood. And we then get some information on etiquette. So to kind of smooth things, we get what is referred to as the Entente. And there are 7 rules for this. Make not war without declaration, bestow knowledge on the newly awakened, steal not from fellow awakened, family is sacrosanct, honor your word, respect your elders and betters, and be subtle lest people know who you are. And these are kind of rules that are generally recognized in the awakened world. This is the closest we have to like a Chatham House rules or something like that. We then also get pacts and promises. These are rules that are generally recognized at a local level but may vary again. Respect power in the unknown. Don't bother mortals or expose your nature to them. Twist not the soul of men against a magus in his domain. Warn travelers of dangers in your domain, and be like waters and dance before the silver moon. I understood what 4 of those meant, but so far so good. We've got some basic information on what the mage world is like. I really would have liked more specifics. I really find this stuff starts coming alive when you say, hey, this is how the order of a traditional meal would go. This is how it varies globally. Here are some of the weird social expectations you would have. No one who hadn't gone to Eton would wear brown shoes on Tuesdays or something like that. Just weird little things that I can dribble into my game that are also kind of hard to find in research because it's hard to pick up on them. At least I find them to be hard to find, like weird things Victorian era. I guess ChatGPT can come in there or something like that, but those tend to be the ones that I need the most help with. Otherwise, it's an okay start. I was really excited about the secret societies. Okay, we have this new level of mage organization. We get the idea that eventually those are going to go away, and that various societies have different structures of organization, and that diplomacy and such between them is more common. This also kind of suggests a world more densely packed with mage, but we'll see how the rest of the book unfolds. What did you think about chapter 1?
Overall, I mean, it was just relentless in painting a picture of a setting that brims with prejudice as well as injustice and despair, for which mages, white Western European mages in particular, are largely just as culpable as sleepers. So like on the one hand, I think reinforcing the fact that mages echo the sleeper communities from which they hail is important. And we're certainly still dealing with the repercussions of lots of this era's horrors and misdeeds today. So like, yeah, you know what the Victorian era is like. Should have maybe at the end of it, comma, because we're still dealing with all of the after effects. On the other hand, my feeling is that the authors want readers to treat the book as a tool to directly examine their own privilege in some cases for some readers, but it's difficult to do that in a game that's about throwing spells at Umbrood. We talked about this a little bit before the show, but the notion of speculative fiction being a mirror for our world, I don't know that it works especially well for a historical role-playing setting, particularly one delivered this confrontationally. So the subtext here is almost like, if you're not willing to put in the work to consider and internalize the direction we're going with this, then you're part of the legacy and the problem. And I worry that wouldn't convince anyone to play who's not already on board with that. Mm-hmm. So that's kind of my overall feel. But there were little individual parts that I really liked. I liked the societies as well, even though I don't have much to hold on to in terms of like how to actually deploy them in a game. There were little bits that kind of rubbed me the wrong way, like the sort of talking about non-binary magi. I'm like, I don't think that was really a conception that was common in the era, or at least as we would conceive of it now. But yeah, I mean, I agree with some of your other points that I could conceive of a more useful walkthrough. As a sidebar, do you know about the sort of biphasic sleep and the change in the Victorian era?
I wasn't aware that it happened in the Victorian era, but...
Well, the introduction of lighting at night being like one of the primary things, and Dickens in particular being one of the last authors to talk about first sleep and second sleep, but that like it was such common knowledge before that that's just the way people lived. So something like that, just these little repercussions on society and culture from the technological innovations that don't necessarily have anything to do with atrocity, that would have maybe made this feel a little bit richer.
Yeah, biphasic sleep being a phenomenon where often you would have 2 sleep periods during the night where maybe you would sleep from shortly after sundown until a little bit after midnight. You would get up and do things for a little bit, and then you would go back and then sleep until dawn or near dawn or something like that. It's part of the field of polyphasic sleep. I don't know if there were traditional times for it. At least I'm just not familiar with it.
I think sundown and sunup is a reasonable.
Yeah, in a lot of cases, you weren't just sleeping 12 hours between the two.
Well, and the invention of the 8-hour workday kind of feeding into that. So you had like the 8 hours of work, 8 hours of rest, 8 hours of sleep. And that became like the default.
Listening to something where someone was talking about the 8 hours of work included transit time, and I felt scandalized by that. Where I was like, what?
Wow.
Ignoring commute. The commute was counted.
Those were the days.
It was also the case that generally you would live very close to where you were working out of kind of necessity. It was also interesting to consider how much social mixing occurred during these periods because you needed your waitstaff to be nearby. Not until you have personal transit do you have the ability to separate yourself from hoi polloi.
You're, according to this book, strangely sexualized waitstaff. So.
Any other thoughts on chapter 1 before I ask for you to guide us through chapter 2, the council?
Plenty of thoughts, but we'll be here all day. So yeah, things like, whatever it was, the precepts, the entente, which mainly just seems like common sense. Yeah. In the same way that the Masquerade and Vampire the Masquerade, it's like, oh, these are our sacred traditions. I'm like, this is just called staying alive.
Well, I mean, a lot of culture is formalizing things that are probably good sense for those who haven't developed said sense yet.
Yeah, that's fair. Anyway, yeah, chapter 2.
The Council of Nine.
Yes. So it opens with a very rapid, I guess we can call it, history of the traditions. Some names get thrown around, and I'm wondering if these are characters from elsewhere in the canon or if they're going to appear in the upcoming... I think there's an upcoming Storyteller's characters. Yes,
there are 2 supplemental texts for Victorian. One is Weird Wonders and Revolutionary Magics. One is a book of characters and places.
So the chapter also tells us that the Ascension War is heating up to its hottest in centuries, and that some of the traditions, namely the Order of Hermes and the Celestial Chorus, are hitching their future success to imperialism, much like the Order of Reason is, and the traditions are fractured as a result. I don't really remember in canon if there is other examples of like intra-tradition schisms over colonialism, but this book leans very heavily into that.
We just don't have a lot of traditions history from about the 700 to the early 20th century. So until the Society of Ether kind of pops into existence, it's one of those things where I frequently make fun of mage timelines having a 300 or 400 year gap. Like, for instance, shortly before this period, we had Shazar's return. I think it was either Shazar or Acrides. I think it was Shazar. For several centuries, the Cultists of Ecstasy and the Euthanatoi were essentially just trying to murder technocrats. Yeah. And I would love information on that because that sounds fun. But yeah.
We then have another, I guess, new concept of Sanctums in the Storm, where it's sometimes a place, sometimes an umbral realm, sometimes a graffiti aesthetic that for each tradition is kind of like their spiritual reset button, a place they can go to feel better about themselves and their place in the Ascension War. Again, much like the secret societies, I wasn't really clear on how I was meant to deploy these as a player or storyteller, but they were fun. I enjoyed the little descriptions for each of them. Did you have a favorite of these sancta? Or
so one of the things that kind of threw me off is, so the Bettini have the Scions of Babel, which meet every 3 years and trade notes. The Akashiana have the 7 Dragon Riddle, which is a martial arts school. Okay. You've the Celestial Chorus, the Gates of Haven. But then, for instance, you have the Hill, which is the Dream Speaker special place which exists within the Dreamtime. But within canon, Dreamtime is distinctly geographically tied.
Yeah.
using the shallowing realm thing. The Sahaja have scribbling in Birmingham. And I did like the Order of Hermes, the Arcanabula Victus, the book containing the names of all
names.
things.
All the names.
All the ham. But of course, my boys, the Chakravanti or the Thanatos, have the Forgotten City with no name, which I assume they refer to as the Forgotten City with no name, thus giving it a name. So
I mean, it's flavorful for sure.
Once you have the word ineffable, you can describe everything.
Yeah.
But did you have a favorite?
I did like the scribbling. I have no idea how I would really use that in a game, but I was like, yeah, okay, cool. The Sahaji, I like to go around and graffiti things. Sure.
Yeah. And again, I wish there were literally any system to support it, because all of these are kind of, there's a notional way to get to this other place using weird magic, which is always uncomfortably lived within Mage because of everything needs to work. If the world itself can't be magical in a certain way, then you can't just have these things freestanding and existing, which has always been, I think, a shortcoming of Mage, but kind of a necessary byproduct of the conceit.
Yeah. Well, in any case, this is the first of many instances where we will move through the traditions in order. The next one is coming up soon. So we learn more about the Council of Nine, or 8 for the last few centuries since the Solificati went kabrams. They're riven by ideological difference, paranoia about corruption in their ranks due to the Nefandi, and disagreement about how to handle the suddenly combative Order of Reason. Do they fight or do they negotiate? And of course, colonialism and imperialism. There's a sidebar on the Keeper of Horizon, who's this mysterious ancient marauder who may have the answers to, I guess, insert whatever you need answers for in your chronicle.
And is notable for being the only case where a marauder notionally has a way out of quiet, because they mention that if you tell them their name, their quiet will end and they will return. It's like, oh, then I guess not a marauder, because that's like their one defining feature.
Look it up in that book that the Hermetics have.
Yeah.
So.
Turns out his name's Mark. But it's Mark with a C. But it's not short for anything. Yeah. Reality.
Thus the quiet ends. There's some Visions for Tomorrow, which consists of a vaguely prophetic poem issued by a Euthanatos. The upshot being many in the traditions feel that their problems will be resolved by refilling the 9th seat on the council, with lots of possibilities bandied about, except for the eventual one in canon, which is the Society of Ether.
The Electrodonks.
The Electrodonks. But you can also just change history if you want. The section points out that imperialism's spread has led to a lot of reports of mysterious crafts and rumors. So if you want to lean into that responsible, albeit not historically accurate, discovery angle, I would like the imperialism theme more if it just kind of doubled down on that and said, like, yeah, you know what? We are going to deal with this theme by talking about how history is different within this setting. Then Traditions at War, which looks at the Ascension War, the march of scientific progress countered by spiritualism and occultism. And here's our next tradition by tradition breakdown. So I guess very briefly, the Alibatine are seeking to unify and resist on the borders of the empires, namely the Ottoman Empire. The Akashiana act as folk heroes and guerrillas against the Order of Reason and kind of counter-export their mysticism to Europe. The Chorus doubles down on control, using imperialism to spread faith, which they can whip up in the new domains as the miserable turn to the church. And then there's a schism between, the Missa Misericordium and the other dudes. Cordus something.
You have the 3 different pontifices that are kind of, we have this weird version of the Babylonian captivity.
Yes.
We've got a bunch of popes excommunicating each
Popes
other.
and anti-popes.
Yep.
Yeah. The chorus is split over that. The Chakravanti are sliding into the trope of vigilante, which is on the rise at this time in pulp literature, and they are doing little surgical strikes against the Order of Reason. The Dream Speakers are unified in resisting imperialism for their own survival, and they're the ones keeping the Umbra mostly out of the Order's hands. Order of Hermes are on the front lines, academically at least, if nothing else, trying to quickly adapt and leverage some of their long dormant power. There are cross-functional alliances of the various houses that combine their talents to combat the Order of Reason directly. The Sahaji are often overlooked, and they fulfill sleepers' thirst for self-expression during this period, undermining the Order of Reason's ideology within society. And then the Verbene, there's an E that appears at the end here. They ride a resurgent interest in witchcraft and use grassroots networks to fight back against the Order. There are repeated references through here to like the different sub-factions within the traditions, and I feel like there are some in here which were not elsewhere in M20, but I was distracted by the number of sentence fragments in the text. So
before we get too far into it, this is some of the first iconic art that we get for this section. Do you think that the art that they used for the traditions broadened it to you? Like, for instance, Verbena Spear Dandy. Good. I liked it. I thought it kind of brought in that kind of return to nature. People may not quite look like what you think they look like, especially in combination with Helen Bonham Carter as the representative of the Sahaja Order of Hermes bookbinder that is going to F you up, and the Chakravanti cowboy.
I would say it's certainly uneven. I'm all for artwork presenting variations on a theme that we haven't seen before. So like the Athanatos cowboy, I'm like, yeah, cool, awesome. I question the spear dandy only because the text is telling us about like the Verbena are in these rural backwards villages keeping the old ways alive in these very impoverished communities. And here's a guy with like breeches.
Yeah.
And it just doesn't, you know.
It seems like that could have been an interpretation of the Verbena for the period they just didn't take.
Yeah.
The Ali Batin Persian fur-wearing Minority Report MAGA seemed odd to me. A lovely piece of art.
Beautiful. Yeah,
yes.
yeah. Cool character. It's just, is this really reflecting what's being said in the text? Speaking of these write-ups, though, so yes, the third tradition by tradition thing are the actual full 2, or in the case of the Akashiana 3-page descriptions of what they're doing in this period. The Ali Batin are divided between supporting Ottoman interests versus unifying the traditions as like these mystics on the fringes, but they're all trying to work to root out Nefandi and drawing recruits from the Sufi schools. The Akashiana are functioning more like an array of independent sub-traditions. Their traditional paradigm is being beset by modernization, but is still thriving in Tibet and Siam. They're helping the Boxer Rebellion, but the various groups disagree on how to deal with imperialism along these sort of 4 factional lines. The Chakravanti are bringing death to the deserving, per the 8-spoked wheel, as they do in every era, I think.
The stabbiest of wheels.
Spiked wheels. But they're leaning into being like urban legends and anti-heroes with a Wild West angle. The Chorus Celestial are dancing their Hey Nani Nani dances, according to this art, divided between militant messianism and missionaries of faith, but also imperialism, because those two things are conjoined in this era.
It has big death will come in the form of Bavarians vibe to it. But.
Bavarian anti-pope.
I think that's my Wu-Tang Clan name.
that could be the alternate title for the book. The Dream Speakers are more unified than most in resisting imperialism and thickening the gauntlet. They're working locally but coordinating globally and umbrally. The Order of Hermes, there's tension between the Old Guard and the newbies, with race, gender, and class lines playing into it. And they're blending into the ceremonial occultism that's popular in the era, much to the Order of Reason's chagrin, because that makes them harder to identify for their deviance. Then the Sahajiya are drawing on the avant-garde art movements of the time to push societal boundaries. They're leveraging spreading literacy rates to reawaken fantasy and interest in folklore. And they're kind of tapping into the much-needed pressure valve of the sleepers in this very oppressive era. Finally, the Verbena are also seeing a surge in recruitment due to that occultism. And that upsets some of the more traditional ones who are like, no, we don't need any of that Gothic stuff. Let's just stick with the old ways. They're actively trying to tear down imperialism and fighting to keep folk truths alive in their little villages. Overall thoughts on Chapter 2, Terry?
It starts giving me an idea of what is different and what is the same in this period. I noticed now that I jumped ahead when you were going through the list of the traditions the second time. I confused that for when they go through the list of traditions the third time.
Yes.
When I asked you about the art. So apologies.
No,
that.
That's this whole chapter in a nutshell.
It does give an idea that all of these groups have not quite figured out what their identities are, but it is a weird mix of smashing together things that were later established and then backporting it. So, for instance, talking about the septarians within the Celestial Chorus. Septarian only makes sense in a chorus that has already been highly diversified. So if we go back to the Messianic voices, for instance, within the Celestial Chorus, which was a weird spot within Dark Ages, it only makes sense to talk about the Messianic voices when they're the dominant group and you're almost assuredly going to encounter one were you to pluck one out at random. So it only makes sense to talk about that in a more diverse chorus. And I don't think we get the background to understand what their current status is.
Yeah.
The varieties of cohesiveness is useful, but one thing that it plagues this book is when there are lists of things, they are not covered uniformly. As in one write-up, it may have 5 bolded sections, and the next write-up, it may have 3, and the next one, it may have 6. So it's not like in every section you can be like, oh, what does initiation look like for these? The art does create a dramatic tension. Like the dream speaker appears to show someone, at least to my limited understanding, someone from the Korean peninsula or near doing art, but we don't get the idea in a lot of the book that type of magical practice would have been included with the dream speakers necessarily at the time. In some cases it says that it would, in some cases it wouldn't. The other thing that gets kind of messy is this book frequently goes back and forth between, is it just about Britain and the British Empire, or is it about the world? We get the idea that the world is, the traditions are much more violent than maybe we might have in a contemporary game, when in the previous chapter, it talks about how the relationships between them seems to be much more cordial, because you have the Entente, you have these secret societies, and so on. So that clash within the book kind of reemerges. I don't feel I have a lot of information on how to make some of these groups maybe interesting. And then kind of the final thing is each multi-page spread includes a book plate in the background, which I thought was kind of interesting. And especially for some of these groups who aren't particularly noted as being tied to traditionally written codices.
Yeah.
It was weird to be like, cultist ecstasis from the library of...
Did you have a hard time like peering, trying to discern what the actual image was behind all of the text? Because I found that frustrating.
I selected all of them and copied them into a different program to look at it. Yeah, I have my moments.
I think I really like the verbena one, but I'm not sure. So
the thing that got me is the fact that you could read a lot of them surprisingly well, because this chapter was the first of several future chapters where the usage of white space was just abysmal. Traditionally in a mage book, the word count will such that be that a sect write-up will neatly tie with the amount of space. That you have 2 pages, you have 2 pages worth of words, and the rest is filled in with logo or size. Half-page blank spots are not uncommon within this, and that just feels weird within a text. That's a minor quibble, just kind of was something that came across to me. My final thought kind of on the chapter was the fact that we got very limited information on the Umbra. It says that on Earth you're removed from horizon politics, and I don't know that we then get much information on horizon politics. 2 things that do pop up, though, is we do get the idea that there are still oracles around, and it indicates that Concordia is a floating island, or at least that's how I kind of read it. And then doesn't describe what Concordia is.
Nope. No, it does not. And for Changeling listeners, Concordia is not the same as Changeling Concordia. Point that out.
I do like the idea that in Changeling it's Concordia, but in Mage it's Concordia.
Yeah. that perhaps.
Hot dog versus hot dog. Concordia being the major city within Horizon, which is not the same as the Horizon. So we too can confuse things senselessly. Any other thoughts on chapter 2?
Well, you just reminded me to point out that the arc of this chapter I found structurally very frustrating, because it starts with this brief overview, then that opens onto a slightly longer overview, then we get the sanctums, then we get more overviewy stuff, then the traditions at war. So there's like the 2 tradition by tradition piece. And then at the end of all that, but before we get into the full 2-page write-ups, there's a section called the Traditions of Magic. That's a page or so. And it's a really good, solid summary of the entire sect in the era. And I'm like, why did you bury this in the middle of this chapter? This should have been the opening, and then you wouldn't have needed a lot of the other stuff. So it's just, that was a bit frustrating. But I mean, out of these, it was interesting looking for the differences and seeing how the traditions looked different in this era. The whole split over imperialism is something you don't really see in the modern version. I did find it weird that the Verbena should suddenly be absolved of any problematic elements, but we can leave that to one side. I think the Bettini and the Sahaggio were my favorite against the backdrop of this era.
Yes.
So,
and you simultaneously get an interesting snapshot of these are the groups that have kind of a unified sense of we're a thing.
Yeah.
And groups that don't. Like the Dream Speakers are presented as we kind of all recognize each other. And then you have the Hermetics, which obviously recognize each other, but that's the problem.
Yes.
We are all the same. You die now.
And there was very little about how paradigm would differ for them, which I thought was a notable absence. Yeah. Like that was something I was expecting to see and didn't. And I was like, oh.
It is weird how in a book that talks so frequently about how the world is changing, how little paradigm seemed to come to the fore. Onward to chapter 3 then?
Excelsior.
Chapter 3, Towers of Stone, Vessels of Steel. This chapter is notable for, on page 66, having the second most infamous, I would say, sidebar in M20, the first being a bit of spirit from how do you do that?
Oh.
And this is entitled, Are We the Baddies? And this is in the section on the Order of Reason. And it says, yes, there we said it. The Order of Reason supports and is complicit in the advancement of imperialism across the globe, shackling and exploiting countless people for the sake of an elite few and a grand vision of empire. I'm not going to disagree with the sentiment here. I'm not going to say, no, the technocracy is secretly the heroes. But this is notable for inverting and breaking one of the few kind of rules that we have in the world of darkness, which is when tragedy strikes that happened in our history, it is because of mortals. Probably best summarized in Spirit Ways, where it said there is no sin or atrocity that a mage has committed that their sleeper fellows did not commit 1,000-fold. And this says, no, the Order of Reason is what allowed imperialism to expand and exist, which raises the question then, okay, then how did it happen in our world in a way that is uncomfortable? I can see that you can set it up largely as a dark thing. The other tension this raises is it says, if you want to be a good Order of Reasonist, but they use the term luminaries, which I kind of like. And there are two options. You can be someone who realizes that you made a mistake, and it says ultimately a chronicle featuring luminary player characters is likely either to be the darkest kind of horror, witnessing the ravenous machine of imperialism from within, or a story of breaking loose from the Order's authority and rebelling against its monstrous excesses. The rest of the chapter then goes through very thoroughly how the Order of Reason is improving the lives of everyone globally.
I don't know if I would call that a tension in the chapter so much as an overt contradiction.
Yes. And I think that is more of a commentary of this book talks about imperialism so much, and then it mentions imperialism, but then doesn't really talk about what it is and how it works. It doesn't talk about the inner workings of imperialism. It doesn't say, hey, the British would come into an area, they would find who the dominant power was, they would heap money and goods upon them, and then play them off against their local, tribal, regional, state, city rivalries. They would figure out what their most important resource was, try and dominate that. They would cut them off from traditional folk ways and ways of providing it so that they would become dependent on it. It didn't give me those tools to actually kind of play that out. If it had done that, I think, hey, we're trying to help, but also we're causing these atrocities, could more easily coexist. And you could very much see the darkness and the light at the same time.
I don't think they even distinguish the differences between imperialism and colonialism at any point, do they? Like they kind of use them interchangeably at a lot of points.
Yes. And I guess my final thing on that is, I don't know that imperialism as a term was heavily used during the time. The term empire building, from my understanding, was a bit more common. And I wish it had moved the terminology around a lot, because I think you and I both experienced semantic satiation over
every day, Terry.
Semantic satiation being the phenomenon whereby you say a word enough and it seemingly loses all meaning. Like if you say your name 30 times in a row, and by the end of it, you're just having an existential crisis. So with that, this also goes through a quick history of everything that happened before it, where they say the craftsmasons were part of the hermetics who were hoarding knowledge, and the craftsmasons wanted to spread it. They referred also to the Cassarify as the Order's secret police, which is okay, but I think one thing that is repeatedly said in Sorcerers Crusade was they were not just the secret police. Like they had this very specific niche that they also filled, but also they had this semi-mystical role of this ancient Byzantine capital B arts, and that theirs was a very practical role. They didn't enforce orthodoxy and adherence so much. And I'm just like, eh. And they said that kind of the big split within the order, when the order kind of loses its moral rightness, is in 1649 during the Digger Rebellion, where craft masons are supporting the Digger Rebellion, who don't want to pay taxes and are trying to seize the means of production, as it were, to put it in Marxist terms, I guess. And then the High Council just sends in the High Guild, the Cabal of Pure Thought, to just swarm the craft masons and destroy them. And they're like, everything after that's been bad. And that may be when the Cassarify also departed. I think it would have been interesting to tie those two together. Also to create the secret back history where the Cassarify and the craft masons were kind of together, which I think would have made Sorcerer's Crusade way more interesting, but that's just me. The Voltarian Order is founded in 1806, which would eventually become the Society of Aether, and the Difference Engineers are founded in 1823, who would eventually become the Virtual Adepts. We get no similar history filling in the missing centuries for the traditions that I saw. In 1836, Albert creates a stable place for learning and understanding in the United Kingdom, in the British Empire, in London. What term should I use? In England?
At the time, it was Great Britain and Ireland, I believe. So the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland.
In 1836, Albert creates a stable place of understanding, and the thing Pook just said, and the first analytical engines are created around this time, but they are indicated as not being widely shared because they have the annoying tendency to control and cause devastating weather. That's my technocracy. We get Albert's World Fair in 1851 that results in a reorganization, and we get the 9 conventions. At this point, we get the Guild of Analytical Reckoners, we get the Hippocratic Circle, the Society of Celestial Masters, the Guild of Electrodyne Engineers, the Void Seekers, the Golden Guild, the Invisible Exchequers, the Light Keepers, and the Brotherhood of Mechanicians. Now, most of those you may be familiar with. The ones that we haven't really talked about before are the Golden Guild, which focuses on mesmerism and desire, the Light Keepers, which kind of fight for secular values and order, and are kind of split their time between being thought police and also kind of being anti-clerical in this interesting way that I wish had been developed. We get more information on the rise of the computers and the ability to build machines that could answer any physical question, and the order going, well, how do we go beyond this? In 1861, Albert dies, and then in 1885, Reginald Proctor of the Order of Reason reaches out to Victoria. Victoria already knows him and what he's doing. Yes. And she also reveals that she has the skeleton keys, her secret police of the supernatural. The way it is presented, you're not sure if they police the supernatural or they themselves are supernatural. And then we get a reformed group, which is broken up into blocks that are groups within the Order of Reason, or now the Technocracy, that kind of work together. In the middle of that, we get an aside about the scramble to gain control over Africa, that the Bantu were notably technocratic. We get an aside on the Elemental Dragons and the Metal Dragons emerging in 1896, and several other regional affiliate groups kind of coming together, but with no tacit recognition of the, I think, Arabic or Islamic Muftashak al-Nur. I don't remember if it's specified as being one versus the other. This is an interesting change, as every edition has treated the Metal Dragons completely differently, where second edition was like, there's this weird thing that may be out there. And Revised kind of had this comedy of bureaucracy where the Metal Dragons very much existed and just didn't raise any issues with the greater technocracy and just kind of did their thing in East Asia and depended on Westerners being ignorant. And then M20 says that it's a nephondic propaganda to say that they're different in any way, shape, or form. And then in here it says in 1896 they merged and there was a celebratory luncheon with finger foods or something like that. In 1892, Archmaster Kepler and Captain Savage set foot on the moon. And in 1893, Tychoides flies around the sun, discovering Autochthonia, which we get an aside on how that could have gone differently. We get a computational master who awakens the computer notionally in what I think is one of the more kind of asides within the book. Again, it's fun because you're the bad guy, apparently. An aside on ether, and it suggests that the technocracy just purged the existence of the notion of ether, which caused all experiments reliant on ether to fail, causing the Society of Ether to leave. And then it recommends that it could have gone differently. And if it had, the Society of Ether would have stayed. The seat of matter would have been filled by the famously materialist Kopaloe, which would have set off a purge of technocrats in the Pacific. Give me that. Why? Shut up and take my money. And then we get into the groups. Any thoughts before we get into the groups?
Just a couple. The Scramble for Africa section, this was kind of an example of the structural issues again, where it starts at the bottom of page 69, you get about a paragraph, and then another paragraph at the top of page 70, and then this big chomper of a sidebar about Victoria's legacy, and then the rest of the Scramble for Africa at the top of page 71. So it's like there's not that much text. It's a hugely important piece of history, doubly so because this setting is like very intensely interested in the themes around that piece of history. And it's like a few paragraphs split and really hard to read and scattered and doesn't really give you anything to work with. That dissonance just kind of really stood out to me. Much like with the tradition section, at the end of all of that, before we get into the 2 and 3 page write-ups, we have a section called The Conventions of the Order of Reason that is a page and a bit, giving a solid overview of the entire situation that's really helpful, buried in the middle of the chapter. The tradition section also seems very invested in highlighting the Ascension War. This one, not so much,
Like,
which is interesting.
The sound of how cool we are.
Yeah.
We then get the blocks of the Order of Reason, and these are voting groups of the conventions within it. Noted, we haven't gotten the description of the conventions yet.
That's the thing. It's like you keep thinking, okay, I know I read this at least 8 times, but I can't remember where.
And each version adds a little bit and is slightly dissonant with each previous copy.
Yep.
Within Invisible Sun, there is a set of art of a Vizsla cocktail party.
Take a drink.
Yep. And it's a whole bunch of Vizsla that are, which is Invisible Sun wizards, having a little bit of a party. And if you put all of them together, it doesn't actually form a collage. Thank you. It doesn't actually form a coherent collage. Every character is depicted in 2 or 3 different ways, and it doesn't quite line up. And it's obviously being done on purpose. I feel like this is the oopsie version of that,
yes,
where it was not necessarily intended. So we get the blocks, the Explorators, which consists of the Void Seekers and the Celestial Masters. The Void Seekers are exploring Earth. The Celestial Masters are exploring space. It says that Herschel finds Uranus and the discovery unifies the group. And the way they describe it is when they say Herschel found Uranus, not through a telescope. Guy went there. So I just picture Herschel walking in, dripping with paradox to this meeting and being like, gentlemen, I believe I've made a novel discovery that will advance the roll of the order, and just drops this methane snowball on the table. That's my technocracy. Yeah. Sure. 200 manservants died on the way.
Significantly before the Victorian era, but I guess we can leave that to one side.
They also suggest that Lord Kelvin is a technocrat by making reference to a Lord Thompson, but Thompson with a P, and then making a reference to Lord William. William Thompson, without a P, was also known as Lord Kelvin, who was a very important physicist in the 19th century, so not sure, and has the ship that says "to measure is to know," which is often attributed to Lord Kelvin as a quote. And we also get the line, again, love my boys. No matter how many enlightened officers fall to the indescribable horrors of the terrestrial and celestial void, the Explorators shall ride out into the unknown. Woo!
Always.
That's called being married to your work. We also then get the Great Faculty. It is 3 groups comprise it: the Hippocratic Circle, the Guild of Electrodyne Engineers, and the Analytical Reckoners, who sometimes vote with the League of Constructors and sometimes not. They believe their job is to bring science to the masses and to arm the masses with the knowledge they need to advance. So their job is to make the masses know more, versus another group we will get whose goal is to more directly give the masses technological advances. They tend to butt heads with the Explorators. They are not strictly the good guys, but they do believe that indigenous peoples have useful knowledge. They probably want to wring it out of them a la wine press, but still.
Yeah.
They seemingly have entry rights everywhere. We get the Ivory Tower, who targets global unity, and they focus on displacing indigenous cultures. The Lightkeepers supplant the Cabal of Pure Thought. The Skeleton Keys eventually join later, making this a proper block as opposed to one group. It is hard to keep track of information in the era, but it provides a lot of avenues for surveillance and the first primitive information networks that we kind of see on a grand scale in the Western world, at least. They are subtle with the Lightkeeper side of things, and the Skeleton Keys are much more overt. The League of Constructors is composed of the Analytical Reckoners, the Electrodyne Engineers, and the Mechanicians. They say that science must be shown working for people so that it seems more focused on the conventions improving materially the lives of sleepers than the Grand Faculty wanting the sleepers to themselves know things. They test the assumptions made by others, and they don't care too much about the work of Other Awakened. We finally get the Syndicate, which consists of the Golden Guild and the Invisible Exchequer. Again, the Syndicate is a group that very much brings together two groups, and I do think this book did a great job of kind of talking about that. Some claim that the Syndicate is too powerful. The Electrodyne engineers oppose the idea of patents, that science can't be controlled that way. They work through the labor of others, and the Syndicate tries to create a great map of enlightened power that will allow it to effortlessly allow magic power to flow. And I think this was kind of an idea of, I like the idea that they were suggesting that we were going to replace the web of faith with a kind of financial web of faith.
Web of capitalism.
Yes, a web of capital. This is also the part where I yell. They frequently make mention of the Industrial Revolution. There were a couple. I think they're referring to the first Industrial Revolution, which is generally put down as 1790 to about 1830. We then get a second one from 1870 to 1920, that second period being the most protracted expansion of quality of life in the Western world to have ever occurred, which was then mirrored by another one that occurred from about 1920 to 1970. For more information, read the book The Rise and Fall of American Growth, which largely covers the Western world in it. We then get the conventions.
At last.
Yes. Timetable is still updated every 15 years. We have the working class Voltairean order, and the Society of Ether is kind of the more upper crust half of it. We get the Guild of Analytical Reckoners. They study fields of analytical perfection. They are born from the difference engines that were bound to physical problems that realized they could advance. They will eventually split into the Iterators and the Virtual Adepts. Some have gone off-world to Aucthonia at this point, but they need engineers. The Zeroth House is listed in Cardiff, Wales, famous for its stone. We get the Society of Celestial Masters, which is traveling the darkness between worlds. The Skyrigger still exists. It is driven by the mathematics as described in the Kerala School and the Trends Samgraha. They know things are out there and they want to find it. They believe that traveling through space allows you to define it. They also are behind reconfiguring space and time, and that they attempt to create time zones to protect time from something. Advancement is defined by accomplishment. We also get Tychoides' dictum, which states that any perfect map of an object is the object relegated to the order of things by divine providence. Skyships of the era are being replaced by Electrodyne machines. Sadly, we do not get information on Victorian balloons, so I assume we're going to have to cover that in a Storyteller Vault supplement.
They do come up later in, I think, Chapter 9. There's a reference. I flagged it for
Thank you. We get the Hippocratic Circle, known as God's Scalpel. They know exactly how much damage modernity is doing. They also talk about exploring the microscopic realm, but microscopic and realm were capitalized, which made me think that it was somewhere out in the Umbra. Like, are these like micronauts?
I think it's just part of the MCU.
Yeah, okay, got it. This is interesting because the Hippocratic Circle, we did get a breakdown into factions. We get the Guild of Apothecaries, the Perfectionists, the Phylaxoi, the battle medic warrior priests, as it were, of the Hippocratic Circle. The Fellowship of Chirurgeons that do the surgical work. We get the Guild of Electrodyne Engineers. Everything is electrical. Indicates that the Cabal of Pure Thought had been destroyed in an internal purge of the secular against the religious. And I would need to do a bunch of checking here, but I don't know if they were talking about the Templar Purge or some later purge that had also occurred, because the Templar Purge was indicated as happening centuries prior to this. Here, Andreas Vargo has etheric ships capable of flying through the etheric sea. They hold on to craft mason symbology. They can take the sphere of ether instead of the sphere of prime. So thanks. They are divided into the Voltarian Order and the Society of Ether. We get the Void Seekers, who were originally fueled by discovery, and we get more of the idea that they are there to banish darkness and to see the terrestrial things that could be harmful. They're the most experienced with night folk. They're very ocean-based, which is why the character art for this shows a British man on safari with a space gun. We get the Golden Guild, who recognizes that the easiest way to control society is by having peasants believe that they can climb. Once that is gone, that is when brutal suppression needs to start occurring. And I'm like, ooh. They are the inheritors of the tools of Arch Cupididae, and they bring the knowledge of desire to the syndicate. They are starting to recognize the importance of labor and how to handle it. Their mandate is to find a home for every citizen in the empire, which there's a couple ways to take that. They often are in charge of building treaties I'd also like to mention the art for this. A number of people knew that I had supported Lore of the Traditions at the art model level and that they won't always support the art model in that same book. So a bunch of people were like, hey, Terry, it's good to see you. I'm like, wait, what? And I crack open the art and it shows a reasonably portly man with glasses and a wedding ring.
And facial hair.
And facial hair holding a person's life in the balance. Puka noted before re-recording, it doesn't quite look like you, but that does look like your balance holding a man's soul. So I was glad that they really captured that in the oeuvre.
I'm glad you took it off the mantle and got some use out of it.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, that's why some of my parties are thinly attended for those who don't cut mustard.
Or at least a little thinner at the end than the start.
The Invisible Exchequers, which is the dumbest name. It's just...
They're right there.
The dumbest name. They deal with the financial side of things. They are the more numbers focused. They are if iteration X decided to boink a calculator, this is what comes out the other side. They have a central fund with 10 directors. We get the Light Keepers, who are the successors to the Gabrielites and the precursors of the NWO. They destroyed records as needed. The Carrington event, which was a giant coronal mass ejection that caused absolute havoc with the World Telegraphy Network, made them go, maybe we need to look into the stuff off-world. I do like the idea that the Carrington event was something weird coming from the deep. It says they tend to be subtle. They have a big surveillance network, but apparently we'll just use vulgar flames coming out of their hands to burn books in the course of character art. We have the Lighthouse within the organization forges political ties, the lanterns, which spies on opposition and kills people, the torches that hunt monsters, and the overseers, who everyone reports to. We have the Brotherhood of Machinists, who are toolmakers, formerly held control over knowledge of the crafts. They are aware of the coming labor movement. They are allies with the Golden Guild, which I thought was interesting, devoted to the constructors as a block, and they have no subparts, as opposed to in Sorcerers Crusade, where the craftsmasons had like 70 of them. And then finally, we have the Skeleton Keys, who were independent and beat out the Light Keepers initially. They are in the U.S., tied to the Pinkertons, which was a private security force. They tend to bring a fresh perspective. They enforce consensus. They are rivals with the Lanterns within the Light Keepers. And they have two forms, the operatives, who are the agents in the field, and the investigators, who gather intelligence. That was a lot.
That is a lot, yeah.
It laid out a lot of interesting stuff in the setting. It's the one case where someone could be like, hey, Terry, can you set up a magical group from the Victorian era and walk through it in detail and have interesting characters with clear motives? And I go, if they're Order of Reason characters, yeah, I could really do it. So kudos to the author for that. Otherwise, it did have the thing where you're like, yeah, I can see why they could be viewed sometimes as the bad guys for using extreme methods, but not overall necessarily the bad guys. I don't think the chapter really sold me on that. What did you think about this chapter, Pook?
Just to your last point, part of that is the very different tone of this chapter, I would say, compared with the other ones that we get for the most part. But yeah, I mean, the thing that I keep getting hung up on is much like the, I guess, bait and switch, can we call it, in Book of the Fallen, where it's like, this is not a player's guide, but here's everything you'll need to know to run in a Founding player. Like, I feel as though, you know, you get that sidebar at the start of the chapter that's like, yes, they are the baddies. They're awful. They're responsible for all of the horrors in this era. But here are some very deeply interesting, well-crafted passages about all of their different alliances and subgroups. And so it's like, I don't know if the goal of the book is to try and make players feel guilty about making the choice to play one of these characters, but like, even if you're doing the good person struggling against the system thing. But yeah, I mean, writing wise, I was here for it. And I say that as someone who never plays a technocracy character. I did find the asymmetry with the traditions chapter notable. The first half is very different. The first half of each chapter, the traditions chapter seems to want the reader to, like I said, focus on the Ascension War, but then also like all of the traditions are kind of split and in turmoil. And here, especially with the blocks, it's much more about what are the alliances these coherent conventions are putting together. Yeah, it's pretty solid. I keep having, as I go through this, ideas for Storyteller's Vault supplements that I would make as spin-offs of this. One would be alternative blocks. I did find them as a concept, like, not really necessary, except to get the number of conventions from 10 down to 5. You know, thinking about, well, how might the Invisible Exchequer align with the Analytical Reckoners? Inventing spreadsheets, maybe, you know. those kinds of possibilities I think would be interesting to explore. And then I also found it criminal that the mechanicians had no mention of Isambard Kingdom Brunel or Joseph Bazalgette, and I would love to do an additional Storyteller's Vault supplement on the construction of Victorian sewers, because I think that would be amazing.
Yeah, they have a mention that the sewers were built, but not by who. Which is interesting, because the mechanicians very much focus on the people doing the work and not the people behind the work, which is appropriate for them. But yes, there's a lot of luminaries of the time, lowercase l, that seemingly go without comment.
I suspect you might also maybe have more affection for the exchequers than I might, because I just like, you know why I play Mage, Terry? Accounting magic. That's what I'm here for.
Well, the thing that I like about it is all of them, I looked at every one of these groups and I'm like, oh no, this really fits.
It fits.
And you can see how eventually you can see where the thing that I like about it, and this is really hard in a historical setting, you can see where they came from and you can see where they're going.
Yeah.
And it makes sense. And I appreciate that, where you can see this weird, you look at the Golden Guild and it's this romantic view of desire and understanding and control. And then this war with the invisible exchequers of being like, no, it's all raw numbers. It's who has the capital. Markets will win.
Still not going to get excited about playing one.
You don't need to get excited about playing one. I just think it's a really dumb name.
Yeah, well, I mean, the most appealing thing to me, I'm looking at the art now and this kind of like ghostly peacock feather quill that she's using to write. I'm like, that's the most interesting piece of this for me.
Yeah, there were a lot of weird swirls of energy. A lot of these characters looked like they had stolen the UI from Minority Report, like the Celestial. Like a lot of these characters have like view screen on energy.
Heads up display.
Yeah. You're like, this is my magical HUD.
To your point about the Lightkeeper art, though, so that dissonance that I was saying about these aren't players you should want to play, but here's all the stuff you need. I think it's strongest with the Lightkeepers for me, because it's like, these are literally the fascists, and you are using art of somebody burning a book.
Yeah.
But then it's, but they recruit women. So it's like, am I supposed to feel like it's not a moral dilemma for me to choose not to play one of these? So I don't know what the sort of motivation was for this. I'm someone who, as a longtime player, I feel comfortable with the golden rule. I'm like, yeah, I'll change whatever I want. But trying to think of it from the perspective of someone who's coming to Mage for the first time or early in their Mage playing, it's like they're probably going to feel a lot less comfortable going against what the text says, what the text is telling them they should be doing. And I feel like it's really muddying the waters at points, especially with the Order of Reason.
On to the crafts?
Onward. Notably a much shorter chapter than the other two.
And shorter than it should be, but anyway.
The opening section here confused me a bit because it's titled The Great Crafts, in which we're told there are three that are as large and as powerful as the traditions.
Yes, decoupage, weaving.
Yes. and contradance. So yes, it's the Bata, the Hollow Ones, and the Wulong. But then it sometimes seems to give information that's about all of the crafts or all of the ones in this chapter, and there's like another 5. So it's just kind of muddled. It repeatedly also says the storyteller need not focus on these 3 crafts to the exclusion of others, as well as giving the same information several times over, occasionally with almost identical phrasing. So I'm really curious what the editing process was. Anyway, the gist is that the crafts are embattled and on the front lines of fighting colonization and imperialism. First, we have the Bata, who are originally based in West Africa, but thanks to the slave trade and other migrations have spread globally. They are very well organized, and their fight to end slavery is making change, but far from over, especially as imperialism continues to spread oppression around the world. There are references to histories of things like Pan-Africanism. I kind of wanted to see more about that, but anyway, that's what we get for them. Then there's the Hollow Ones. They are a Western European mix of theosophists and Marxists. That's their whole thing. So it feels like they're meant to be the sort of good European mages, but I'm not sure how from this. They really also wanted to get the sexual persecution element in there. I don't know, maybe because of like Oscar Wilde, but I always kind of have a yellow alert when I see statements about historical gender constructions and social conventions around them, because often when people do historical setting stuff like this, they take the understandings of contemporary times and project them backwards in ways that the people in this era might not have really, comprehended or talked about in the same terms. Last of the great crafts is the Wulong, who are based in China. They are in disarray and trying to figure out how to resist order, reason, and foreign intrusion, especially after losing the Opium Wars. Their fate that's kind of listed here all points to the Boxer Rebellion, but it's presented more as an opportunity for you to do alternative history things, like what if they did succeed and drive out all of the, whatever they were called, concessions. So there's a couple unanswered questions that I have in here too. So like there's a reference to the order of reason paradigm overrunning the Wulongs. And I'm like, well, how? I mean, I'm not clear exactly on all of the dynamics of reality zones, but I don't think the game is either.
Yeah.
So anyway, then we get more crafts. The book states that there are over 100. The population of the world in 1870 is estimated to be about 1.3 billion. I don't know how many mages you need to sustain a craft, but multiply that by 100 and then some, and we've got a lot of mages running around, I feel.
I interpret this as, in a lot of cases, it being a small group of allied mages within a geography whose practice and paradigm have kind of merged out of necessity. Like, for instance, you have any area like the dense polities of kind of West and Central Africa. At the time, each of those cities has its own group, and I could see that being defined as a craft.
All right.
Or didn't necessarily recognize the traditions or hadn't merged into them yet. So you may have a group of folk witches who don't pursue the Ascension conflict and then would be viewed as a craft or something, even though you and I looking at it might be like, oh, they're clearly verbena or something. Like, that's my thought.
Okay.
But I mean, there are a lot of cultures out there. This book isn't sure when it's okay to talk about mixing them and when it's not. So the fact that you and I live in a major urban area where we can get a dozen authentic ethnic cuisines, I think you and I would consider that to be a good thing about cultural cultural blending. Absolutely. And such. One of the things that Mage seems to have difficulty with is figuring out what, air quotes here, good cultural mixing is and bad cultural mixing, for lack of a better term. Cultural appropriation is a thing, but cultural misappropriation is the bad thing.
In any case, the crafts are presented as being important on a local scale and often syncretic in their magic, kind of adapting and drawing on what they can in order to survive.
And that's a neat story to run. Here's the local mages you're going to have to work with. You're going to have to figure out how to make your stuff fit with them. But
especially in light of that theme of imperialism.
Yes.
Like, to what degree does one adapt versus resist? The examples we get are the Comanche-Puha, who are based among the Comanche. They are isolationist and individualistic, with a lot of healing and martial magic. There's the Kopaloe, the Polynesian animists, who are split between whether to drive off all the imperialists, change to accommodate new ways, or conceal themselves, but whichever direction they go, they're figuring out they have to work together better than they hitherto have been. There are the Ngoma, who know that they are fighting a losing battle against the scramble for Africa, but they still work to save who and what they can from their respective cultural groups, and they're assisted by the Bata'a, kind of taking the fight directly to the order of reason and distracting their foes so that the Ngoma can do their work behind the scenes. The Sisters of Hippolyta, I guess it makes sense that they would be suffragettes here, but I feel like
it feels real reductionist.
There must have been other interesting directions to take this, I would wager. And then a criminally short section on the Taftani about how they're split over whether to support the Ottomans or fend off imperialism altogether in order to keep their paradigm of wonderment alive. Then there are independent technomancers, of which there are, again, dozens of groups, we're told. They are somewhat outside the order of reasons, racism, and elitism. So I don't know if the implication is that they are not European, but we have the Dalulaoshi, the artisans of China who are excited about technology. They're cautiously trying to modernize China on their own terms as a method of fending off colonialism. And they have interest in Pan-Asian kind of alliance and unification, which some of their Wulong, I guess, frenemies are opposed to. There's a line in here that says, currently there is much dissension. And I'm like, that could be the tagline for every single group in this book. There are the Jidai, who are listed as next era, but friend of the show Charles Siegel has pointed out that Jidai is just the word for era. Along the same lines as the Daruloshi, they are trying to use new technology and technomancy to modernize Japan in harmony with their culture so that it can defend itself from intrusion. And then lastly, there are the Zulu mechanists. They build their magic on top of European technologies to create weapons and tools to help their people resist colonialism within its own paradigm. This I thought was a really cool idea, kind of bridging multiple themes, and I really wish we had more like this. Those are the crafts. Any favorites in here?
As you mentioned, currently dealing with great strife, I got confused trying to keep track of what was happening in East Asia because we have the Dalalashi, who are the Chinese artisan mages. And one of the interesting things that they've always presented is that kind of the five elemental dragons were always more interested in order and the right conduct of society versus technological progress as kind of a mechanism. And I would have liked some more information on that interaction. Yeah, the Zulu machinists were fascinated. I can't even remember if it's this book where it's like, if imperialism had been a little bit slower, would the Zulus have been sufficiently unified to fight off invading powers? And that's one of those, oh man, that's give me more of that. I thought, just like you, the Sisters of Hippolyta being reductionist was a bit much. And then sometimes these internal questions, history gives us the answer. So by Revise, the Taftani are mostly in the empty quarter of Saudi Arabia. So like, we know how that turned out.
But you can change it if you want to.
Yes. I do like the fight within the Kopoloe between the Ali'i, who want to drive away the invaders, and the Kahuna, who are like, we just can't do it, which is not necessarily how I thought that split would have played out. But for some of these, it seems really hard. How would I bring this into a game? I do think some of the write-ups are criminally short. I would have also liked that bolded list of just give me a half dozen more, but at the same time, we do get the secret societies who kind of do that. I don't know what the difference now is between a craft and a secret society. So the Lions of Singapore, the Lions of Sri Lanka, I can't remember off the top of my head, like what would make that a secret society versus anything else, except for it implies now that area is large enough that if it is a secret society to have multiple factions, because otherwise it's just a craft or a drinking club or something like that, which I'm also fine with. I really thought the crafts were going to get a bit more of a glow up, and I'm not sure why. I thought these were going to get proper spreads. I think the biggest one is, how do you talk about the hollow ones? One, this predating the poem from which the name came, and two, without talking about the romantics. Like, how do we not talk about the last gasp of romanticism, like as it dies on the heels of the end of the first industrial revolution, and like the work of Thomas Hardy or something like that, or Lord Byron. So that just felt like a mix. The one thing that seemed to be a change was my reading of this is it presented the Bata'a as still using West African magic as opposed to Afro-Caribbean magic. So it suggests that the Bata'a were still active on the continent of Africa and West Africa, centered around Benin. And my reading was that the Bata'a didn't exist, really. They were a result of the crafts of West Africa needing to adapt to this new lifestyle, and then baking in little bits of it and mixing together this diaspora into a people. That's just kind of a codicil and a footnote, but I would have loved to have seen that kind of the mage version of undergoing the changeling way. What do you do to survive in extreme duress? And how do the people who you came from now treat you?
Yeah. Oh, that's a bit at the end. That's interesting. Yeah. My sense just in terms of the Bata'a was that it was kind of, because the Scramble for Africa piece is happening over the course of what this book covers. So like from the start to the finish, maybe they're no longer in Africa. But it does say, they do exist in lots of different places throughout Central and South America and the Caribbean and everything. I felt like tonally, this chapter had a lot more in common with the traditions chapter, because it, again, brings in imperialism and colonialism a lot. But that feels a lot more in line with the identity of the crafts and what they would be caring about. So what this book seems to care about most, particularly in connection with those themes, it rings, if not truest, it feels like it fits best with the crafts here. The conflicts that they face are pretty straightforward with like clearly delineated, It's a crisis of morals kind of thing. But yeah, I too wish that they had gotten longer write-ups, because there are cool ideas in here which don't always have the space that they could. I guess they didn't want to recreate like the disparate alliance thing. And so we don't get like these, here's the state of the crafts, because it's like, well, no, it's each individual craft is in its own place. But
I also got the feeling, and this may just be because history, None of the crafts are winning out of this.
Mm-hmm.
None of them are better at the end of the period than they were necessarily at the start, except for you could argue that, for instance, the Bata'ah spread.
Or the hollow ones formalize or something.
I kind of would have liked to see some of that, some more winners and losers, as it were. Like in the tradition section, we all get a clear sense of, hey, they're taking it in the face, but this is the pre-Ascension War. A friend of the show, Ches Kellner, talked about if they were in charge of Mage, how they probably would have rewritten it to make the first industrial revolution to be the start of the Ascension conflict, as opposed to Mist Ridge, blah, 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 blah. And in that framework, Victorian Mage really shines, because you do get the idea that it's like, oh, wow, they are trouncing us. Other weird thing to me, they talk about how well the Order of Reason is doing. And that is simply, to me, because they kind of picked the right horse in the form of British Empire. Like they just, it happened to be a case where cultural hegemony and political hegemony was spread throughout a significant fraction of the world in a relatively short period of time. So it's not because the Order of Reason was any good at itself, but boy, howdy, did they pick a winner.
Well, and also, like, I mean, it is very focused on the British Empire. Yeah. So we get nothing really about, like, the history of Spanish colonialism or French colonialism or Dutch or Portuguese. And part of that is because those empires were maybe on a lot shakier foundations by this period in history. That kind of presents other possibilities for addressing the themes that this book leans into that, I don't know, maybe would give a little bit more variation.
Yeah. We also, to my knowledge, don't get much information about East Asian colonial powers.
There's a bit about Japan.
Yeah.
But
you list the wrong year that the spinning jenny was invented, I will notice that immediately. You can move the start of the founding of the U.S. a century in either direction. I'll be like, no, that seems right. Looks legit.
It's definitely one of the centuries.
Yeah, exactly. Chapter 5 is Dramatis Personae, and it focuses on character creation. This is absolutely necessary if you're going to make a character and mostly use this book. The big technology that it introduces is it changes the player questions. What intrigues you about the era? What kind of character intrigues you? And how would you like to see your character grow? Which, whenever I read that as, where do you see your character being in 5 years? As if they're taking an interview. There's a few more interesting things that it asks you to consider. The concepts that you can play may vary. How do you want to define affiliation? We get some commentary on how abilities are going to be different, that literacy is not universal, blatancy is highly subjective, computer may or may not exist, how crafts might be different. And this is just a reminder that Mage really shouldn't have secondaries. Then we get some revisions on what the Victorian backgrounds would look like, what do technocratic enhancements look like, what do resources look like, and then we get a illustration on page 123 that seemingly steals very clearly from a recontinuation of Twin Peaks.
I love that art.
It's good art. Yes, it shows a Victorian woman seemingly with parasol removing her face to reveal a void of stars. So,
as any self-respecting woman would in this era.
This chapter felt a little bit messy to me because one of the things that you run into is it didn't have enough information to run the game by itself, and it had more information than you need if you already had read M20. But I think this was done with an eye towards players will pretty easily figure out what firearms means. Mm. But for character creation, maybe I want things that I can present to them. So it was this weird mix of storyteller facing and player facing stuff, which never really quite coexists in my head at the same time. What did you think, Pook?
It was fine. I did find the opening a little bit strange because it kind of starts with these very broad strokes about, oh, you should use this opportunity to break out of preconceived notions about what people and characters would be like in this era, even though the whole book has hitherto said mages are as subject to prejudices as everybody else. But then it gives these like highly specific examples and muddled tone, which I really wasn't sure what they wanted me to get out of it in terms of creating a character that goes either above and beyond or lateral to standard character creation. I did think the piece about science and the esoteric was a useful one on page 120, where it kind of talks about figuring out for your character and especially for their focus where you stand in relation to this rapidly changing technological world. I will say, in addition to having different player questions, there are also some prelude questions. If you actually go through and do all of the prelude questions along the lines that they have suggested here, congratulations, you are now a novelist, because there's a lot. The opening of page 118, it's 2 sentences at the start of the character creation section, and I think in many ways this sums up the whole book. Creating characters for Victorian Mage follows the same 5-step process as described in M20, pages 248 to 253. Immerse yourself in a tumultuous era of change and mystery. That's the character creation directive here. So we do also have the bit in here that societies are a vector by which you can learn spheres. And so that I was glad to see, like, oh, good. An actionable mechanical thing off of this narrative thing that you've already introduced. One last thing about the structural issues again is this kind of opening about what it means to be a person in this era, all of that. If that's like the capital P point of this book, why is it not in the introduction? And I keep having that. I think once per chapter, I ask that question.
The book didn't know what it wanted to be, and it didn't have the time for it to kind of coalesce, seemingly.
I think the book wanted to be as many different things as there were authors, and maybe then a few more.
Yeah.
And it tries to have it always, but doesn't always thread that needle.
Chapter 6 is entitled Spells and Steel, Victorian Magicks. And this is the section on Victorian magic. It's a pretty meaty chapter. I'll give it that. There aren't a lot of systematic changes to it, but we get, instead of vulgar, coincidental, and vulgar with witnesses, as it were, we get elegant, which is magic that displays grace and propriety, that is quiet, it fits in with its area, it is invisible, only botches will garner points of paradox. Uncanny, which is something people will be slightly uneasy around and feels a little bit wrong, is a step beyond local beliefs. You get 1 point of paradox on a success and 1+ on the highest sphere for a botch. And then we have catastrophic magic, where the uncanny is eerie and small, catastrophic is large, obvious, unnatural movements, often devastating. Even with a success, you get 2 points of paradox. Paradox in the setting is referred to as the straits, or you get 2 times quantity, 1+ the highest sphere on a botch for catastrophic. The straits in this era tends to manifest as elemental phenomenon, weather, weird changes around you, sickness, or sudden violence. Bygones are comparatively easy to find compared to modernity, and instead, straits may bestow a dot of resonance on you, which bleeds off in a day or so. We get new terms. Instead of paradox realms, we have mysterious disappearances. We have straits apparitions instead of paradox spirits, and we get wizard's twilight as opposed to quiet. This indicates that in this era, quiet is easier to step into, requiring only 7 points of straits or paradox to enter rather than 10. And then we get some information on territories or reality zones that we get. And it breaks down into kind of 4 or 5. First is Heartland of the Empire, defined by what seems to be right and proper in the context of a budding empire. The occult underworld, these are the strange places outside of public view, inside hidden cathedrals and parlors and dark cellars and sewers and so on. The edge of dominion, which can kind of be anything. I do appreciate the discussion on frequently the edge of your dominion is the start of someone else's. Be mindful of that. And then we get flux states, where 2 paradigms are running into each other and can result in almost any type of zone being created. And I thought that was interesting, that metaphysical chaos ensues when 2 reality zones bump into each other very suddenly. We get a recognition kind of what the physical form is required to cause a reality zone to shift, that it requires laying tracks of steel. It requires introducing mass texts promulgating the views and opinions of the empire. It requires the death of priests and local regions and heads of state. And I would have liked some more formalized rules for it. It does the thing which I call the M22 step. It says more information can be found in a different book, and then you consult the different book, and there really isn't that much more information to be had there. So implying that there's more system here than there is. Then we get a quick rundown of some of the beliefs that may be interesting or important in this era. This is the first modern instantiation of decadence, the idea of living to excess, the first time that we get something akin to live fast, die young, leave a pretty corpse. Hedonism becomes kind of more formal. We have these demi-hermetic societies that believe in benevolent secret masters. We have the rise of theosophy. I kind of want to do a weird episode on the history of theosophy in Mage, but it gets real anti-Semitic and
it really does
real quick. So the Hermetics look at that and are like, your heart's in the right place, but we're very uncomfortable with this. And when a Hermetic says that they're uncomfortable with something, that's a sign.
Think about your choices.
Yeah, we get a return of the secret Templars, of there were being weird true knights. Christians are looking into esoteric history in odd ways. Most of this spurned on by just kind of how cheap mass market paperbacks are and the public lecture circuit, and also people making more money and just kind of having leisure. I really wish it had focused on that day-to-day life stuff. We have the rise of, this is the first era in which what we would recognize as hypertech would appear. Although I do like a prehistoric mage game where someone suddenly has a bow and it being like, that's hypertech or something
or the
like
wheel.
that. As I'm fond of pointing, almost everyone has a wheel. The hard part is an axle. That takes a lot of work to figure out.
Just because you can make a pot doesn't mean you can move some horses.
Exactly.
So.
The popularization of hypnosis and mesmerism, with Mesmer actually being around at this point. Psychotherapy comes onto the scene very, 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 very 30 minutes before the close of this window. We have the rise of medievalism and neo-paganism coming out, spiritualism, and the seance scene was huge. Stage magic as a type of performance was being advanced in this era. We get an aside on what were some of the more popular beliefs from the rest of the empire that were being pulled in, like vision dance style prophecy, voodoo, and yoga. And it mentions that kind of syncretism it describes as the degree to which a practitioner wants to blend the traditional with the modern. So this was fine. Again, I almost always wish it had more detail, and it was punctured with, and you're a bad person if you do it this particular way.
Yeah.
But such is the way of things. Pook, what did you think of chapter 6?
Overall, I liked it. I think it got more and more useful as it went on.
Yes.
So the terminology changes like elegant and uncanny are fun, but I don't think I needed that much time spent on them. I kind of felt like straits sounded like a metaphysical digestive issue, like, oh, got a bad case of the straits. But I like the idea of adapting paradox to fit the mood of the setting. They reference the scourge from Sorcerers Crusade as well as like another example. And the territory rules, I should probably go back and reread how reality zones are presented in M20, because I really enjoyed things like, oh, each type of territory has its own little mechanical quirk, and seeing how those interact. I kind of want to go back and flesh this out more, because like you're saying, there's not really enough to stand on in this chapter alone. What I also really liked was, for that last list of like whatever is called Victorian occult innovations, I did like the idea of looking at these historical events through the lens of focus. So like, yeah, the rise of decadentism, what would that look like as a combination of paradigms, practices, and instruments? And how would you turn that into magic? I think the quiet section tried to do the same thing, but just not as well. So overall, it was solid. I think sometimes it was straining for items to put into each of its little buckets, but the fact that we got an entire page bar on page 143 of common focus elements, and it's like all of them. Yeah. So was this necessary?
Knots and ropes.
Plus like everything from Book of the Fallen. Go figure.
Chapter 7 is entitled Storytelling, Gaslit, Mysteries. And it gives us literally the ABCs of accountability, building the story, and collaborative atmosphere. And we get a pretty interesting mechanism that they introduce, where they say, on a scale of 0 to 5, how much do you want this to be action, adventure, horror, gore, relationships and romance, politics and drama? Great, good. How much do you want to focus on the oppositional power of capitalism versus socialism? I don't know that era would have necessarily had a common understanding of those terms in that way, but whatever. But this goes back to Pook's earlier point on be careful of how we project what we know now back onto a previous era.
Ideology is always retroactive. Remember, kids.
We then get a large list of things that killed a lot of people with the Napoleonic Wars and wars that followed. I love this list because it's like, oh, by the way, all of this is a rounding error to what would come later. I
have to just mention, I would like to double check some of these numbers. And later on, there's a note that in sort of alternative histories, there's like, what if the Civil War in America killed another 100 million people? And I was like, wait, hold up, hang on.
Yeah. And a lot of these are also including military and civilian deaths, which fine.
Yeah.
That is not often necessarily how we think of casualty counts. So I'm not saying like a civilian death doesn't count. It gets a little bit messy. And the Napoleonic Wars were more of an era than...
Yeah. And notably, the Paraguayan War, I went looking for the statistics and I found the ones they have here. And they were like, these are based on numbers that have since been disproven. So I don't know what the source was for these, but...
We're going to call that an oopsie. But it does also note that it does include the useful head count that comes from rebellions, like how many people died in the Indian Rebellion, how many people died in the Dungan Revolt and such. And that does kind of give you a number to kind of put around the horrors of the technocracy, if indeed we are going to lay the entirety of everything that happens during this era at their feet, which is the only time in mage history we do this.
Yes.
We get some recommendations on how to portray science and technology, some alternative history, and then we get story hooks. Mage has never really excelled at giving story hooks in the way other games do. They're oddly templated with two bold headings, one immediately after each other, with the first being indented. We do get an optional rule on alienism. We get some information on if we want to theme it based on various ideas, how to do that. It includes alternative histories like 20,000 Leagues Beneath the Sea or science fiction. We get some information on how to do steampunk, which
It had to be in here somewhere.
Yes.
So
I think it would have been bold to do it. But like the thing that gets me about it is like the American West almost nowhere is kind of mentioned in any length. Like Werewolf Wild West had books full of it, and we just get like Dusty
Trails.
which was my cowboy stripper name.
Oh, there you go.
Yeah. We also get the templating thing of page 177 having a sidebar that is its own page and that consists of nothing else and is otherwise blank. We get a few mechanics kind of to support it. The idea of a reversal, that is, if we want to have a gothic antagonist perform to the gothic type. And to me, it gives a bunch of recommendations on how to build traits. Do you want someone to have to be a corruptor, a mastermind? Are they the monster? What is their signature style of how their plans come out? This is kind of the era where people would have grand plans and reveal them to characters and so on. And this created this point pool mechanic, which is the first player-focused mechanic that we actually have in Mage, which I think is interesting. This doesn't represent the character themselves. This is a meta-narrative conceit for how many times will this person come back before you can kind of finally put them down. But kind of my notes were questions you need to ask for yourself are, what flavor do you want? What year are you choosing? What location is it set? What does the figure of authority look like that you are pushing against? What is the scale of the game? How 19th century do you want it to be? How actiony, horror-y, politic-y, and relationship romancy do you want it to be? And that's an okay framework. I'll take it. There are worse storytelling chapters in Mage. It does have plot hooks. It does have a little bit of mechanics, so it's got that going for it. What did you think about Chapter 7, Pook?
I quite liked it, I will admit, because, going into this book, this is what I wanted. This is the information that I'm here for. And overall, I think it's fine. There were some, I thought, absences, which, to be fair, did get addressed later in the book. So, for example, at this point, I don't think we heard anything about the revolutions of 1848. And I was like, this is a notable absence, but then it does come up later. With the various setting options, ultimately, the sort of pulpy adventure stuff is the most appealing. So like the League of Extraordinary Magicians or even the steampunk. The other one that I personally like is what they title the Oliver Twist one. It's very like street level, early days of mass urbanization. I'm here for that game, but I understand a lot of other people won't be. I also don't think these are mutually exclusive. You can have steampunk on the streets.
Steampunk on the streets, Oliver Twist in the sheets.
It's going to be my bumper sticker. I do think those more adventure ones allow the most flexibility with the scales in that checklist, like how much weight you want to give those socio-historical issues and the issue of prejudice, which gets its own sidebar as well. So the storyteller has more freedom to decide how they want to handle something like income inequality in a 20,000 Leagues game. You can go from not at all to quite a bit than you do in a high society game where it has to be present there in some form. The sections could have probably been a little bit better integrated, templating issues aside. It's not clear if there's a genre setting and flavor section and then the genre variant section. And I'm like, are you supposed to like put one with the other? Because they kind of have different approaches. Like one has mechanical options and one doesn't. One has story hooks and one doesn't. So yeah, I would have liked it to be a little bit better put together. But the information itself, I quite liked.
Chapter 8, Dangerous to Know. Walk us through Victorian weaponry.
Yeah, well, there's so much of it too. Yeah, we start with a very long list of weapons. The only things of note that I really want to say in here is that in addition to the little traits like range and ammunition and concealment, we have M and X, where M stands for malfunction and X stands for explodes. And this is what happens to your weapon when a straits backlash is rolled against you, potentially. It also has the year it was introduced, which is a good thing to have for this table. Gun cane, that was a thing.
So many swords.
Then we get into absinthe, opium, and other concoctions, where they talk all about substance use in the era. All of them function mechanically the same as an M20, but they talk about how alcohol and caffeine have become very widespread. Opiates, laudanum, and absinthe are popular. Heroin and cocaine are synthesized and widely distributed by the end of the era.
Everyone has time 3.
Everyone has time 3 and is taking as many actions as they can snort. Or I guess inject at that point.
And taking 2 bashing damage, I think, in addition to it.
That's par for the course in this era. Everything caused bashing damage.
Everything caused bashing damage. Waking up in the morning was 2 points of bashing damage. I think that's a good way of summarizing if we wanted to mechanize working at a factory. Like, the day begins, take 3 points of bashing damage.
Yeah, but then take your cocaine so that you can be a proud and effective member of the assembly line.
Yeah.
Then we get the theater of my miseries, which is a fancy way of saying that the world is a world of darkness and it's also Victorian. So there's a whole bunch of antagonists. We start with the Marauders, mostly the same as in Modern Mage, but with different era-specific causes. I did notice the line in here where they talk about, being sensitive and creative people like gamers who have a hard time fitting in with society. It's like, So yeah, the Marauders, each of these sections has like a sample character or two, and I actually quite liked the first one here, which is Old Muddy. And Old Muddy is a humanoid slime puppet elementalist working to protect its fellow sewer folk. That ungendered character will be front and center in my upcoming Victorian Sewers Storyteller Vault supplement. There's also Razor Jake, who's a former prison tough, now a street gang / cult leader with Arate 7 and Razor Fists. Then we get a whole bunch of mortals, and these are really just templates that you kind of need to hang little details on as ornaments so that they can become individuals. So these include the arcane practitioner, who's like the gentleman occultist, the costermonger, who's like a street vendor, the decadent demimonde, who are the bohemians, domestic servant, which is, like I said before, gets like weirdly into them being sexualized. Okay. My favorite is the Resurrection Man, who's the body snatcher. So much story potential for any World of Darkness game. But a bunch more, like Urchin and Constable and everything. Nothing terribly unexpected. I would have liked to see more of the many varied sewer-related professions that were common at the time, but what can you do?
I liked Roughneck Ombre. Because I can only imagine that in the style of a cowboy in the Pace Thick and Chucking commercial.
I wasn't clear why they used ombre until you framed it that way. So now I'm like, all right, yeah. Then we get the Nefandi. Obviously, they are thriving, and they personify the hypocrisy of the age. They have the respectable surface and the rotten core with predation as their ideal. And honestly, I like that kind of black hole of solipsism take on the Nefandi better than almost any of the others that come up in the book.
Star Squid.
So it works for them. The example characters we get are Lord Edgar Croft, Crisis on the Thames. He has ungodly levels of backgrounds. And then Rose Reboul-Lachaud, the Pale Mistress. She is a sociopathic artisan who makes torture machines. They're fine, I guess, as antagonists. And then we get the Night Folk. There's a nice little sidebar of inspirations where they talk about how this was kind of the dawn of the modern concept of the monster. And I like that they get into it to some degree here. Like we're moving away from folklore monsters to more literary monsters in this period. We have the Fair Folk, who are best distributed in mage games when they're simply passing through. And there's this baked-in story between the two templates of a Fey enchantress and her sort of shattered Fey artist, which works well for the setting. I would love to see a Victorian Changeling the Dreaming. I know there was Victorian Lost, but like Victorian Dreaming would be cool. Then you have Ghostly Phantoms. They are perfect for the sort of spiritualist, gothic, or I suppose post-genocidal chronicle, because that's the thing the book keeps bringing in. It makes me think of like The Innocents as source material. I would like to get that kind of uncanny ghost story. Primordial Werebeasts. The Darwin angle is an interesting one that could have been explored further, but then they immediately throw it aside and talk about corvids instead. And I'm okay with that because I like corvids. And then straight apparitions, who are the paradox spirits. We have the Black Gunmen, who are shadowy soldiers that punish violations in the forces, mind, and spirit spheres. The doppelganger, because this is the era of the evil twin trope, and they get spawned against correspondence, life, and mind mishaps. Incendio, who explodes from forces and matter effects, also known as Powderbane, who I think was in Sorcerers Crusade.
Yeah, I think so.
And Pastosiweo, a Kree tornado spirit who comes for misuse of correspondence, forces, matter, and spirit. So there's a couple spheres not represented here. Old Man Wrinkle is like a throwaway reference somewhere, but I'm really curious about like, what does an entropy straight apparition look like in this era? Finally, vampires, really not much, probably because they have their own Victorian supplements and indeed their own little subgame in Victorian era. There is the useful note that the common ideas about vampires in terms of like garlic and crosses and all of that, a lot of those don't form until late in the era. Dracula wasn't published until 1897, and the film Nosferatu came out much after the Victorian era. Otherwise, they're more or less the same as they are in modern times.
The thing that annoys me about some of the quick characters is when they're like, attributes 1 to 5. Okay, why are we spending dots on this?
Excellent.
I would have liked fewer words with most of these and then just have more that I could pull from. There isn't a sense of interconnected between the two. I would have liked a Victorian Wraith supplement, because if you look at that art on page 203,
Yeah.
whew, use
good.
and have it on me, baby. Did you want to bring up your weird bit of scholarship regarding Wehrbeast?
They use Wehrbeast spelled W-E-H-R, which as far as I can tell is a very rare variant spelling in German. And on its own, Wehrbeast just means dam beast, like someone who holds back water flows, but also changes shape, I guess.
Like where is in Weir?
Yeah, it's the
okay.
same root. Yeah, weird.
Interesting.
Yeah.
But yeah, it was fine. It's a necessary chapter. You move through it. You might get an inspiration. You might not. Especially for the paradox ones, I want more little ones just to make sure that I have like a low, medium, and high that covers each sphere. I do like the multicultural ones, but the problem with that is if paradox spirits conform to your culture, we now have a paradox spirit that only makes sense if you're a member of that. So, or you could tie it to an area kind of. So to me, you just need a lot of them. They're a little bit geographically or paradigmically bound.
More content for the vault.
More for the vault. Paradox spirits I have known and loved. Anything before chapter 9?
I feel like the book is trying to head off the worst possible uses of its content at the pass, but kind of with little justification, because I have yet to meet the mage player who's thinking like, oh, I can't wait to play this historical setting so I can be as racist as possible. Like, I think that most players would, if you gave them a few succinct reminders about the era's mores, they would get the message and understand like, oh, okay, this is what the history entails. I need to decide as a player, but then a group has to decide as well how they're going to engage with that. But when I see this much text just like bashing over, going over and over again on it, I feel like the book doesn't trust its players to be aware enough or able to separate out the injustices from the wonders of the era that probably drew them in the first place. Even though, as the book repeatedly points out, they're living in its aftermath. So like, yeah, they would be familiar. It really took me out of it.
As Monty Cook says, there is no way for a game to insulate itself against adversarial players.
Yeah.
So don't bother. He talked about it in the context of these weird rules, exceptions, and so on that are like, you can't do this with this. And he's like, this is stupid.
As an alternative, why not support the players who are cognizant of these issues and need support to find ways to deal with that in the game?
Well, so the way I would want to do it is I would take this page and do things you didn't know existed in the Victorian era.
Yeah.
Like what portion of pirates were actually black? Or something like that, or what portion of gunslingers were Jewish, or I don't know. I'm not familiar enough to know what tropes necessarily to break, but to be like, hey, this thing existed, like samurai and Abraham Lincoln coexisted is probably the common one. There was a 2-year window where a samurai could send a fax to Abraham Lincoln or something like that.
And kind of illustrating where the line of alternate history actually is. Yeah. So it's like, no, this wasn't something that didn't exist. This was just something that wasn't as visible, but you could absolutely include it in your game. And
the way you fight trope is by providing so many good alternatives that you never feel like a storyteller needs to reflexively reach for the mad Arab like that. That's me. Also, tables help. I'm a big fan of random number generators for that kind of stuff.
Do you think it's more necessary for less experienced players? Because if that's the justification for including it, I guess I can understand that more.
I don't know, because some of the tone of it is so heavy-handed that it may just scare off some people.
Yeah,
so I
that
don't
too.
know what that trade-off. I don't know what that trade-off really is going to be.
Perhaps we'll have to leave that as an unanswered question as we move into chapter 9.
As we move into chapter 9, entitled Around the World. I think it's entitled Around the World.
Yes.
So this is the chapter that just kind of does a snapshot of the world. It's a lot. It's 50 pages. We ain't going to cover it.
Greatest hits.
Yes, we get a vague reference to the great game being played between the British and the Russians across Central Asia. I would have liked more information on colonial power versus colonial power, because that seems like a fantastic place to have play space. Like the war to carve up Africa, the different powers ran into each other at different pieces. I want a mage game where you play those powers off across themselves. That seems like a case where your character could use their ability to move between societies or to be a liminal character to advance something really interesting. We get the idea that the Congress of Berlin has recently reorganized the borders of the Balkans. Order of the Broken Wheel sees humans as a corrupting force, not technologies. Bismarck is on the scene after the Franco-Prussian War. Africa in this section as a continent, I thought had a lot of really interesting things. It mentions that the Hem-Kosobek exists, that Ethiopia contains the relics of Axum, the Ark of the Covenant, and the Choristers are interested in this. There's a great chantry of Ngoma inside buried cities. The Eye of the Sahara is still existing. There's a dried up lake bed that hosts a vast armor court, whose name I can't pronounce, and I'll hope Pook will pick up on that one. Makgadikgadi. We have the Congo Free State with a heavy Shadowlands presence. Tell me more about this. Ashanti drumming is a form of communication. We get some information on some of the other folk beliefs of the area. The Hindu Kalika Rajas just absolutely crushing the Void Seekers. The Naga societies invited to join the Daula Laoshi. The Knights Templar are hiding in Korea and then flee to the Philippines. And we get the introduction of the Naga societies in India, where we're like, holy crap, something happened in India in Mage for once that was not the rise of Zapathasthora. But those were kind of my high points. And that is literally me spending 2 minutes to go over 50 pages. What were your 4 or 5?
We're tired,
favorites?
everyone.
Yeah.
So, my absolute favorite was the aerial bombardment of Venice, which is, I quote, the first aggressive use of balloons in warfare. Noted for the future. Yeah, I agree that the Africa section was probably the richest and the most interesting. I also really liked the South America one because it's an area for which I don't know much of the 19th century history. That being said, I did kind of do a double take when they included Cuba and Hispaniola in South America.
That's a choice.
So, okay.
Yeah.
Similarly, when they included Hawaii and New Zealand in Asia, I was like, oh, okay, well, I guess we're going to put them somewhere. The thing that really kind of threw me about this chapter, though, was the asynchronicity between the sections in terms of how they were structured. Because some of them go sort of sub-geography by sub-geography. Some of them go time period by time period. Some of them combine those two things, and some of them are just random theme stuff. So like North America doesn't really have any through line. It's just, here's this topic. It was also kind of filled with walls of text. I really could have used an art piece to like break up rather than these letters.
Early on in chapter 2, we get one piece of art in 12 pages. It's a half pager, and it's the first time in Mage that I know of that we have uninterrupted pages without even headers. To break them up.
But a lot of this information, I'm all for including historical information in books. I know people say, oh, it's not necessary anymore. I think, though, this might be too much detail even for me. So
a timeline of major beats. I think something like that would have been important, maybe at the continent-wide level, or like wars of note or wars of interest to mages.
Well, that's the thing. There's a lot of these where the relevance to the Awakened is not even, like, there's ones where there's nothing at all. It's just sleeper history. And you're like, okay, but I guess I can work something out with this, but it would be helpful to have something for a reader to latch onto. And I assume part of this has to do with the way the writing was distributed. Like different authors probably handle different continents.
Yeah.
But
we went through that in an absolute flash. I don't know enough about history to be like, oh, this was good or bad or what have you. It was littered with mentions to mages. I wish we got specific names of Maga, Magi, Magu.
Oh, don't get me started.
And terms that were done. Any thoughts on the chapter before we talk about our thoughts overall?
There's always more that they could have talked about. And so I'm trying to focus on the way that they talked about what they did include. And what I'm left with was this probably didn't need to be 50 some pages long. Also, it ends on a really downer note by just kind of talking about the Armenian genocide, and that is the final words of this book. It's important as a piece of history, but going from that into here's our list of Kickstarter backers was, or not Kickstarter, whatever it was on, Indiegogo.
It's also interesting because it's also clearly an event that occurs after the window of the text.
Also that, yeah. The soft boundary on the quote unquote Victorian era.
So overall, didn't have enough art. Wasn't very well illustrated. Some of the character art was pretty interesting. It wasn't sufficiently evocative of the period. It didn't feel like it was dripping with flavor. The whole book didn't feel very World of Darknessy. There wasn't a strong sense of urban grime, even though it wanted you to feel that. Like, we didn't get a description of what it was like to live in a Manchester factory district or anything like that. It really just assumed that we knew what the Victorian era was and how it should be depicted and how it should go on. The text feels internally contradictory and ignores the rest of the mage canon. It repeatedly makes statements about the era and how wide it is. It talks about how the technocracy is poised to take over the world, despite requiring a sleeper in the form of Albert and then Victoria to kind of make sense of it. The traditions are listed as falling to hubris, despite just frankly being in shambles. There just aren't enough specifics. We get no conversation on House Tharsis or House Luxor within this. Tharsis, we know, falls to diabolism in some way.
And Luxor opens a casino.
Yeah. Confusing uses of quotation marks and italicization, and other times not, and sometimes scare quotes, and sometimes not. Sometimes group names are in quotes, and foreign terms are or are not italicized.
Even game terms, Jor is like, do you uppercase or lowercase? Take a pick.
You know what? It's a Tuesday. There's the odd tension about whether this game is about the British or everyone else. I really think it should have picked. This book was all over the place. It had some really, really fun stuff. But the problem is it's hard for me to even point to a specific section. I can say the technocracy section was interesting. The Order of Reason section was really cool. And it was pretty well done. But I would have trouble saying go here, 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 and here. So it is just kind of littered throughout. So if you're a fan of the period or really a fan of Mage or a completionist, do this. I don't know what this would give you that a little bit of historical research wouldn't have. And it's a big lift to ask someone to read a 295-page book to kind of get,
just a bit
all of it. I do suspect that this may be one of the things like with Technocracy Reloaded, where Technocracy Reloaded told me nothing, but the operative's the agent's dossier was 90 pages of good, clean fun. I'm hoping it's kind of the same thing here. I understand why it was hitting on themes and so on. And it's perfectly fine to say imperialism bad, but it didn't give me the tools. Going back to my opening questions, did it give me the tools to talk about and portray imperialism within a game? No. Did it give me interesting characters doing interesting things in the setting? Yes. Will it help me run a game during the area? Kind of. The individual magic rules are okay. I really thought there would have been more. One of the things that you run into with a historical game is, does magical innovation exist and what does it look like? This book doesn't have a rote in it.
No. I just noticed that actually once you said
there
it.
isn't a magic in it.
Yeah.
It talks heavily about paradigm, especially going back to the M20 ones. In some cases, even that conversation is complicated because it'll just make up new ones, which is fine, but that's not how M20 talks about it. It kind of talks about these paradigms that need to be broken down. This book is a little bit disorganized. I know it had a troubled development history, and sadly, I think it shows in the final product. What did you think, Pook?
Well, to your point earlier about the issue of having multiple different authors and everyone thinking, oh, I know I have to hit the theme in my writing piece and then multiply that by 10. It is that sense of like, you're just getting the same sort of text just over and over. And yes, it is important to bear in mind and consider when you're putting your game together, but I don't need to be told the same issues of imperialism every single paragraph, sometimes multiple times in a paragraph.
And to the exclusion of the content, I would need to actually run that as a problem in Cork and Seat.
And I sense that many of the player and character choices that one does make using this book are being evaluated by the authors even as they're being presented. So it's like, well, you could do this, but you're a bad person if you do. Like I said before, I'm willing to roll with that. I'm sure a lot of players would not be. They also seem uninterested in telling detailed stories about like the cosmopolitanism of the time, or at least in any context other than as a struggle against the system. So it kind of railroads you into certain thematic paths. I question a lot of the structural choices, again, the repetition, but then also just like the placement of those sections in the traditions and order of reason chapter. And there are so many things that I want to like because the era is so rich with content and material, but the book almost seems committed to me not liking it or not liking myself for wanting to like it. So I'd be very curious to know what the development guidelines were for the book and how stringently everyone followed them or was expected to follow them, and what amount of coordination, if any, there was between authors. Similar to what you said, if I wanted to do like a cut and say, like, okay, here's the parts that I would recommend, I think it would have to almost go this paragraph, then turn 2 pages, that paragraph, because it's like you can't even.
I may as well just rewrite it and create a 5-page reference for my players.
I don't regret that it exists. I'm glad that it has added new material to the canon, but in terms of the stuff that I'm liable to actually draw into a game, it doesn't need 295 pages probably.
Well, we'll hope the supplements add to it appreciably. And if they do, we look forward to either Pook and I or someone else sharing that with our listeners.
There have been a few nuggets released that have seemed interesting on the onyxpath website.
I hope people don't hate what I wrote, but we'll get to that in the fullness of time. As always, people can find you at Changeling the Podcast.
And elsewhere.
And links to those will be in the show notes. This is certainly not your first visit to Mage the Podcast Manor. Anything in particular you want to call out?
And it's just the same announcement that I said earlier about the project we're working on. We will be returning to the digital airwaves ourselves in about a month. So if you like Changeling, stay tuned for season 3.
Awesome. Pook, thank you so much for joining.
Likewise.
This has been Mage the Podcast, where we don't think you need so many reminders of what would be period appropriate, except for the part where you keep wanting to add more hypertech ninjas. This show is made possible by our executive producers, who include the following oracles behind a number of secret societies, such as Ben Bendelow, Oracle of the Derbyshire Ticklebottoms, Buck Gregory, Oracle of the Albemarle Choir Ladies, Christopher Phillips, Oracle of the Society of the Blazing Pentagon, Guy Stewart, Oracle of the Reykjavik Volcano Jumpers, Jay Widener, Oracle of the Peking Door Appreciation Society, Josh Hillerup, Oracle of Champlain's Posse, Mikhail, Oracle of the Dark Academians, Puka G, Oracle of the Benny Frank Hoopmasters, Sean Gallagher, Oracle of the South Island Thumpers, the Crew of Erebus, Oracle of the Magical Tragical Interdimensional Double Dutch Kids, Saint UX Player, Oracle of the Deseret Busy Bees, and Sorcerer Sanguine, Oracle of Team Rocket, along with Archmaster Andrew Adelstein, Archmaster Brad the Blue, Archmaster Dan Svensson, Archmaster Derek Semsek, Archmaster Leroy Bryce, Archmaster Michael Parker, Archmaster Morgan Aran, Archmaster Nathan Weaver, Archmaster Wolf Larryson, Alex, Alexia, Ambiversion, Andrews S., Anon, Bedurfy, Berto, Blaze Hibbert, Blake Ryan, Brandon, Bryce Perry, Bubba the Pale One, Chris Blake, Sin Shodas, Daniel Cuppin, Daniel Scribner, Darren Hennessy, David Roy, Dennis Osborne, Eli Levenger, Eric Schwenk, Fraggerock, Friedrich Owl, George Laura, Henry Kraft, Ia Bowl, Jason Kennedy, Jason Vines, Jason W. Briggs, Jay Gatsby, Jeff Bryn, Jenna F., Jervis Johnson, John Magnuson, Jolyn Andes, Laws and Stuff, Kathleen Halperin, Chris Kinner, Leslie Weatherstone, Manel Canos, Michael Pearl, Michael Creedle, Nibero, Neil Patterson, Nikita Klaymanov, Oliver Schindler, Patrick McNamara, Patrick Mulder, Rachel Grace, Ricardo, Richard Bat Brewster, Robart the Robot, Rubem Joseph, Ryan Stray, Rob H., Ryan Kendi, Samuel Tobin, Sev Nessus, Starfish, Stephen Carton, Thrice Great, Vincent Hamilton, Walter, William Connolly, and William Martin. Our EP shout-out this week is to Saint UX Player, who I assume is the patron saint of fixing poor user experience design. Here are 5 changes I think they individually brought about. The jump to the recipe button at the top of recipe listings so you can skip the 500 words of SEO text. The only necessary cookies button for GDPR-compliant web pages. Web pages that default to having the add me to your mailing list box unchecked. Font drop-downs and accessibility overlays, and web videos that default to showing the subtitles because I'm old. I assume Saint UX Player's enemy is the phenomenon where you see the worst possible thing, an unsubscribe link in a new email that is already purple because you've clicked on it before and nothing happened. Whenever I click on necessary cookies only, Saint UX Player, I'll think of you. Rather listen on YouTube, search Mage the Podcast on YouTube to find our full library there. If you super liked us or super didn't, send us a message at magethepodcast@gmail.com or at Mage the Podcast on Twitter. We have a hop in Discord community at discord.me/magethepodcast. Mage the Podcast is also available on Mastodon on dice.camp at Mage the Podcast. If you like us, please give us a review on the platform of your choosing or tell a friend about us. Also go to magethepodcast.com for show notes and all of our previous shows. Now go change reality. Bye.
I guess we should do this horse shit. Put on the podcast, you know.
What is the article of clothing that one puts on to podcast? Like, because this podcast, hat, pants, burnoose.
Pod pants. No, that wouldn't work. I think bolo tie, I think would be fun. A podcasting cravat.
A pod caftan?
Could get behind that.
Perhaps.
A pod shaw. I don't know many articles of clothing that kind of start with pod. And this is the part where you're being put on the spot, kind of like the name a woman meme. And it's secretly there are 17 things that all begin with pod. Are you familiar with the name a woman meme?
I'm not.
It's a thing where you simply ask your boyfriend, name a woman.
Okay.
And humor is elicited by the difficulty of this task, despite historically there having been roughly 54 billion of them. So what I would describe as a non-trivial number is actually
half or slightly more than half of
exactly
the population.
And just one of those things like name a song. And you're like, I've never heard music music before in my life now that I've been put onto the spot. And apparently Cleopatra is a common answer, which I appreciate. Yeah, we got that going for us.
Interesting.
Yeah.
That's like, people being put on the spot, I think, want to demonstrate how smart they are and how deep their knowledge is. And it's interesting that Cleopatra is like the point to which all of that converges. But I feel like I could easily name a woman or a song.
Yes.
All right.
I would probably go with Eleanor of Aquitaine.
Ah.
Do you remember Blaseball as a phenomenon?
I do not.
It was this weird internet, what was referred to as a splort, where it was entirely randomized. The rules regularly changed. And it was just random number generators. The Philadelphia Pie was our local team with the slogan of Pie or Die.
Okay.
You had the Seattle Wave, and their slogan was "Smells like Team Spirit," which I very much appreciated. The first character in the game that had this particular stat that the equivalent of the 6 dot in baseball was this notable charactress within the game, and the wiki for this listed all of her documented girlfriends, and it was just like a who's who of history's greats, and it just stuck out to me where it was like rumored consort of Eleanor of Aquitaine, and I'm here for it.
All right.
Maria Theresa would imply, I think, that she's a bit more of a hussy than I had thought in my head, but that's just me.
Or a hussar.
Yes, noted for her horsemanship. Adam is not interested in the Victorian period, and after reading this, I can see why. But we're not going to start out with such negativity. Will your podcast still exist in 2025?
That remains to be seen and heard, Terry.
Let's see if the forever winter comes for us first.
Tentatively, I will say yes.
Nice.
Yes.
Nice. Because it's one of those things where it's like 25 years of Vampire the Masquerade. They went for like 17 years just off of books.
Yep.
Because of what they had access to. Mage, we have a little over 100 tomes of Magic episodes. Changeling, man, that feels like an uphill battle.
I won't call it an uphill battle, but it's certainly you have to keep laying down more track for your train to go on.
Yes.
For sure.
I still think we should start Mummy the Podcast, strictly talking about Mummy the Resurrection. So
chapter by chapter?
Yeah. Yes.
Drag it out as long as possible.
Waiting for Mummy the Resurrection.